Chapter 841. The elven race worshipped the goddess of life and practiced nature magic, so they were very close to nature. This was also why the elven race was able to defend the wind forest in the past. In the wind forest, the elves were blessed by nature. The goddess of life, one of the 12 main gods, had bestowed upon the elves beautiful appearances and long lifespans, allowing them to survive and establish a foothold for themselves. The tree of life, which had existed for over 10,000 years, and the spring of life that flowed from beneath the tree, was a generous gift from the goddess of life. The elves used the spring of life to wash away the impurities that had accumulated over the past year, and received the blessings of the goddess of life. This was the most important annual ceremony of the elven race. All elves in the wind forest had once been able to participate, but elven slaves were now excluded. All of the elves put on their best attire to attend this grand and solemn ceremony. Tens of thousands of elves gathered in front of the square in the cave where the Tree of Life was situated. The circular well constructed from white jade was enshrouded by a magic barrier, and the clear spring of life rippled slightly within the well, attracting the attention of all of the elves. The elves stood in a strict manner according to their status, and there was a hint of tension in their neat formation. The 8 major families stood at the very front of the line, and the elves in luxurious attire were basking in the envious gazes of the elves. The elves were still arriving, and the leaders of the major families weren't in a hurry to start lining up, so most of them hadn't appeared yet. "Have you heard? Her Majesty is in seclusion, and she won't be hosting this ceremony." "Really? Why would Her Majesty suddenly go into seclusion? Who's going to be hosting this ceremony? Could it be Princess Irina?" "Of course it's true. It's not the princess hosting, it's Mistress Helena. This isn't something that small families like yours have the right to know. However, the ceremony is about to begin, so there's no harm in letting you know." A piece of news quickly spread through the line. After being suppressed for an entire night, the announcement that Her Majesty had made the night before was finally released, and it created quite a stir. In the past, Her Majesty had always been the one in charge of the ceremonies, and she had never asked for leave. She would only be woken up for matters of life and death, which made them even more worried about Her Majesty's health. Over the years, the Queen had rarely managed the affairs of the clan. She spent most of her time in seclusion. It was said that it was an old injury she had sustained during the racial war. However, no one had seen her in action, so no one knew how her body was doing. Now that he had suddenly gone into seclusion on the eve of the ceremony and made such an announcement, it was inevitable that people would think of something bad. Almost all the elves had arrived, and the patriarchs and elders of the major families had also begun to enter. Elliot and Vincent's eyes met briefly in the air before they looked away calmly, smiling as they greeted the elves they were familiar with. The Bybilly family and the Brewster family were both part of the 8 great families, so the two of them naturally stood at the very front. After the patriarchs of the 8 great clans entered, the scene gradually quieted down. "The Elder Committee has arrived." At this moment, a voice sounded from outside. All of the elves parted to form a path before extending respectful salutes. 11 elderly elves in white robes walked slowly through the crowd of elves with magic staffs in their hands, arriving at the very front of the group. 12 chairs had already been arranged in an arc, and all of the elves sat down with solemn expressions. However, the 3rd seat from the left was empty. "Master Borge and Mistress Helena have arrived." Right at this moment, another loud voice sounded. The tall and broad Borge strode into the hall with his hands clasped behind his back. All of the elves on either side of the hall bowed in a respectful manner, and even the panel of elders rose to their feet. Even though they didn't extend respectful salutes like normal elves, they still expressed their respect. Among these two, one of them was Mistress Helena, who had been hailed as one of the twin stars of the elven race along with the Queen. She was responsible for establishing a powerful and stable base for the elven race, as well as accumulating enough power for a counterattack. As for Borge, he was hailed as the war god of the elven race and was the Queen's right-hand man. He had helped the Queen slay countless enemies and made many illustrious achievements on the battlefield. In the face of these two beings who held extremely high statuses and prestige in the elven race, even the esteemed elders of the panel of elders had to express their respect. Borge and Helena made their way through the path that all of the elves had opened up before stopping on the platform above the panel of elders. Borge turned to all of the elves and announced in a loud voice, "My brethren, Her Majesty made an announcement yesterday that she's going into seclusion for some time. From this day forth, all of the elven race's matters will be decided by the panel of elders, and today's ceremony will be presided over by High Priestess Helena." Even though all of the elves had already heard some news about this, they were still rather uneasy to hear this from Borge. The elven race had become more powerful, but everyone had already grown accustomed to the Queen's protection, so it was inevitable that some of them would have some bad premonitions about her decision to go into seclusion for an indefinite period of time. Borge swept his gaze across all of the elves present, and said in a deep voice, "There's no need to panic, everyone. Her Majesty is only going into seclusion to progress to the next level. During this period of time, I will be protecting the Wind Forest and all of our elven brethren. No enemies will be able to invade." All of the elves gradually calmed down upon hearing Borge's words, and a hint of reverence appeared in their eyes as they looked at Borge. Helena's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at Borge, but her expression remained completely unchanged. Borge's smile faded, and a serious expression appeared on his face as he said, "However, before the ceremony commences, there's something that I have to do. This matter concerns every single elf in the elven race, as well as whether the laws that maintain order in the elven race can continue to function. Most importantly, it has to do with the fate of the entire elven race." "What is it?" All of the elves were perplexed. What could it be that Master Borge was being so serious about? Helena's brows furrowed slightly as she cast her gaze toward the cave, only to find that it was completely silent. 2 months ago, the leader of the Kroll family, Schubert, died for no apparent reason, and our elven race lost a powerful 10th-tier great magic caster. 5 days ago, the leader of the Elven Guards, an 8th-tier wood-type magic caster, Colby, was killed on the spot while leading a team to capture traitors, and all of the traitors were released. Borge's grim expression was tinged with a hint of grief. And the one who did all of this was none other than Irina, who was given the title of princess. All of the elves' expressions gradually changed upon hearing this. There had always been different theories regarding the deaths of Schubert and Colby, but Irina had always been one of them. However, Irina had always held an extremely high status in the elven race, so most elves believed that Schubert and Colby were at fault. However, judging from Master Borge's words, that didn't seem to be the case. "I believe that Irina has already been corrupted by dark magic and has become a traitor. As such, she's no longer worthy of being the elven princess. I request that the panel of elders abolish Irina from her position as princess." Chapter 842. The griffin flew over the surface of the lake, and the whistling winds swept up ripples across the calm surface of the lake. Meg looked down at the schools of fish that were fleeing in all directions, and a joyful smile appeared on his face. This was a much better feeling than taking a helicopter. After circling around the Wind Forest and entering Warden Lake, they didn't encounter any elves along the way. After avoiding the 3 elven patrol squads, Meg commanded the griffin to swoop down and fly close to the surface of the lake. Warden Lake was very large, and there were small islands scattered across the surface of the lake. Golden reeds could be seen all over the surface of the lake, and it wasn't a bottomless lake, making it very easy for the griffin to conceal itself. However, it was exactly because of this that catching a duck in such a massive body of water wasn't as simple as Meg had imagined. The griffin swept across the reeds, startling a flock of water birds, wild ducks, swans, and all kinds of unknown birds. They flew in all directions, and some of them were even frightened by the griffin's aura, falling straight into the water and dying of fright. "Restrain your aura. We are not Detective Conan. Wherever we go, there will be death," Mag said helplessly as he looked at the waterfowls that had fallen belly up on the water behind them. The purple-striped griffin nodded. It retracted its powerful aura and became much gentler. Although there were still various birds flying around, at least it wasn't as tragic as before, where not a single bird was left behind. Meg's eyes widened as he stared at the birds flying out of the reeds, but even after half an hour, he still didn't discover anything. A resigned look appeared on his face as he said, "System, what does that red-top tricolor cat, duck look like?" Can you at least give me a picture of it? Host, can't you imagine what it looks like even with such an obvious name? That's a duck with red feathers and 3 different colors. Do you understand now? The system said in a tone that was exasperated at the fact that he had failed to meet its expectations. Just give me a picture. Meg rolled his eyes. He hadn't seen a duck that looked like this during this entire journey. All right, looks like I overestimated you. An image appeared in Meg's mind, and it depicted an indescribably ugly duck. To put it simply, it was as if someone had caught a white swan, then painted its head with red paint, followed by green, black, and red paint all over its body. In the end, it had transformed into a duck. Meg was silent for a moment before a complex expression appeared on his face. System, you didn't draw this duck, did you? Is this a new species that you created on a whim? Host, your way of thinking is very narrow-minded. Nature's uncanny workmanship can even create a face like yours. Why should I be the one to draw this duck? Also, this duck may be ugly, but when God closed a door, he also left a window. Its meat is so delicious that it's even more delicious than that of a swan's meat. Is it a good thing for a duck to have delicious meat? When God closed the door, he also sealed the window and tossed a grenade into it, Meg said with a shrug. Well. The system paused momentarily before continuing. In any case, just follow this image. If you want to obtain the best ingredients, you have to be diligent and patient. They often hide in unexpected places, so it's not easy to find them. As if I'll believe you. Meg rolled his eyes, but he still began to inspect his surroundings more carefully. The ceremony was going to last for around 3 hours, and he had to find the tricolor duck within that time frame. Only then would he be able to complete his mission. Borge's voice trailed off, and everyone fell silent. Hesitant expressions appeared on all of the elves' faces. Borge had listed Irina's crimes, but he was still quite hesitant to remove Irina from her position as the princess. As the princess of the elven race, Irina had been acknowledged by the Tree of Life at birth, and had received special blessings from the Goddess of Life ever since she was a child. She possessed astonishing aptitude, and was the most powerful being among the younger generation of the elven race. She was even more powerful than the elves who had lived for several centuries, and was almost invincible in the elven race. She was the pride of the elven race, and the princess in the hearts of all the elves. She was the next elven queen. She had become a 10th-tier magic caster at only 30 years of age, and she still had an extremely long lifespan ahead of her. No one knew how far she would go in the future, and perhaps she would become even more powerful than the elven queen. However, Borge was now going to remove her from her position as the princess. An eye for an eye. Even if she's a princess, she can't kill her own kind for no reason. That's not something a princess would do. Schubert was such a kind elf, and he was my best friend for several centuries, but he was killed by Irina for no reason at all. The leader of the Bearman family was quite emotional. The leader of the Earhart family also chimed in a cold voice. Irina has repeatedly obstructed our race from capturing traitors, and even killed Schubert and Colby because of traitors. Master Borge is right. Her actions have already made her a traitor. Not only should she be removed from her position as the princess, she should also be killed on the spot. We have to avenge our fallen brethren. On behalf of the Bullard family, I support the removal of Irina from her position as the princess. Please vote on this. I also support the removal of Irina from her position as the princess. In just a few minutes, 4 of the 8 major families had expressed their support for the removal of Irina from her position as the princess. Immediately thereafter, even more family leaders also expressed their support. All of a sudden, everyone on the plaza was yelling, "Remove Irina from her position as the princess. Avenge our fallen brethren." Borge cast his gaze toward the 4 major families that hadn't expressed their support, and a cold light flashed through his eyes. All of the family leaders didn't dare to look directly at Borge as they turned toward Helena in unison, including Elliot and Vincent. All of the family leaders who didn't say anything in the crowd were also looking at Helena. Even many of the elders in the panel of elders were looking at Helena. As the high priestess, Helena's prestige in the elven race was second only to that of the queen, and second only to Borge. Furthermore, The queen had rarely interfered in the affairs of the elven race, so Helena was basically the one who was running the elven race, including the formulation of the system. As such, even though Borge's set family was very powerful, he still wasn't able to make all of the major families swear allegiance to him. The family system was first proposed by Helena, and she was the one who had promoted it. Most of the family leaders present had been promoted by her. As such, her stance was very important. Borge's brows furrowed as he turned to Helena, and said, "High Priestess Helena, the goddess of life and the queen have chosen me. Who do you think you are to remove me from my position?" Chapter 843. Princess Irina. All of the elves turned toward the cave, only to find Irina slowly making her way out of the cave in a long white dress. Her cold expression was extremely calm, and she didn't seem to be fearful in the slightest in the face of all of the elves' condemnation. All of the young elves were beginning to waver. Not only was Irina the princess of the elven race, she was also the idol and goddess in the hearts of all of the younger elves. All of the elves wanted to live a carefree life like Irina and become as powerful as she was. In their hearts, Irina was no different from a queen. In fact, they were already convinced that she was going to be the next queen. However, Borge had repeatedly accused her of crimes and wanted her deposed. There were even some family leaders who were calling for her to be killed. However, Irina had now appeared. She was just as straightforward and powerful as ever. She didn't try to evade or explain herself, and her powerful aura instantly intimidated everyone present. Even the family leaders of the 8 major families who had been speaking up earlier had involuntarily shut their mouths. It was undeniable that she was simply too powerful to ignore. Regardless of whether it was the fact that she had slain Schubert as soon as she emerged from seclusion, or the fact that she had joined forces with Alex to slay 7 10th-tier great magic casters in Rodu a few days ago, the rumors of Irina's decline in power from 3 years ago were completely dispelled. She was still the same powerful princess who struck fear into the hearts of all. Irina stopped in front of the Spring of Life and looked at Borge through the spring water as she said in a cold and mocking voice, "Looks like you can't wait any longer, Borge. His Majesty has only just gone into seclusion, and you're already in such a hurry to ascend to the throne?" Borge turned to Irina with a cold expression, and said, "Irina, you've killed your brethren for no reason and released traitors on many occasions. All signs point to the fact that you've been corrupted by dark magic, and you've turned your back on the goddess of life and become a traitor." All of the elves began to look at Irina with anger in their eyes. The goddess of life was the faith of the elves. It was a faith that had protected and guided the elves through many difficult times. All those who betrayed the goddess of life were called traitors. They cultivated evil dark magic and were treacherous. Even if they were captured and brought back to the Wind Forest to be baptized, they could only become slaves. If Irina really did betray the goddess of life, then she would be a traitor who practiced dark magic and the enemy of the entire elven race. This was something that no elf could tolerate. Dark magic. Hair. A mocking smile appeared on Irina's face as she looked at Borge. A burst of green light appeared over her palm, and a seed began to sprout before growing into a small tree. Specks of green light floated out from the cave behind her. A branch of the Tree of Life stretched out from the entrance of the cave, circled around Irina, and then gently touched the small tree. The faint green light sprinkled on the small tree, making the tender green leaves feel a bit more sparkling. "Borge, what right do you have to call me a traitor? Do you think you can just spout nonsense with that mouth of yours?" Irina looked at Borge as she slowly raised the small tree in her hand. "If I were a traitor, would the Tree of Life have discovered me later than you? If I betrayed the goddess of life, would the Tree of Life have traveled thousands of kilometers to deliver life force energy to me when I almost died in Rodu? If I were using dark magic, how would I be able to make this seed grow?" All of the elves looked at the small tree in Irina's hand, and the branch of the Tree of Life that was circling around her in an intimate manner. All of them fell silent as they turned to look at Borge with puzzled expressions. The Tree of Life was a holy tree bestowed upon the elven race by the goddess of life. Even though it couldn't speak, it possessed extremely high divinity. Only the past queens had been able to receive the acknowledgement of the Tree of Life, and Irina was the first elf to have received the acknowledgement of the Tree of Life before she had even ascended to the throne. A few days ago, Irina had been in danger in Rodu, and powerful fluctuations had appeared from the Tree of Life. All of the elven race had witnessed the phenomenon that had occurred due to the outpouring of life force energy. There was no way that a traitor who cultivated dark magic would be able to receive the acknowledgement of the Tree of Life, as the aura of death possessed by dark magic was the exact opposite of the aura of life. High Priestess Helena, do you think I've cultivated dark magic? Or do you also think I'm a traitor? Irina turned to Helena with a serious expression. All of the elves also turned to Helena. Aside from the panel of elders, only High Priestess Helena had the same right to speak as Borg. Princess Irina hasn't cultivated dark magic, so there's no way that the aura of dark magic could escape the detection of the Tree of Life. Helena shook her head as she looked at Irina, and said, as for whether Princess Irina is a traitor, I won't comment as I don't have any evidence to prove that she's a traitor. Irina turned to Irina with a hint of surprise in her eyes. Much to her surprise, Helena didn't kick Borg while he was down. Borg took a meaningful glance at Helena with a wary look in his eyes. He had never been able to tell what she wanted, and it was no different this time. Her Highness hasn't cultivated dark magic, so there's no way that she's a traitor. That's not necessarily the case. She killed Master Schubert and Master Colby for the sake of the traitors. If she's not a traitor, then why would she do something like that? Her Majesty has also issued a decree to abolish slavery. Seeing as those traitors have already returned to the forest and received the baptism of the water of life, why should they be subjected to all kinds of torture? Is that the right thing to do? They are traitors. They've betrayed their faith and the forest. This humiliation will forever be etched onto their bodies, and will be passed down by their descendants for all eternity. They don't deserve to be referred to as elves anymore. They can only be lowly slaves. That's right. They're lowly slaves. All of the elves began to debate over whether Irina was a traitor or not. There were occasionally some who spoke up for the slaves, but their voices were quickly drowned out by a torrent of furious abuse. Borg's expression returned to normal, and he turned to Irina as he said in a cold voice, I don't know how you managed to fool the Tree of Life, but it's not up to you to decide whether you're a traitor or not. Her Majesty is in seclusion, and the panel of elders is currently presiding over the elves' affairs. Whether you're a traitor or not is up to the panel of elders. You have to pay for what you've done. Chapter 844. Freedom should be above everything else. We should not be restrained or persecuted. This is what the elves should pursue. Power, wealth, desire. When the elves choose to pursue these things, you are the real rebels. Irina's voice was not loud, but it clearly traveled into the ears of every elf in the Wind Forest. The elves present gradually quietened down, and a thoughtful look appeared on their faces. Some elves even looked ashamed. She really does resemble Her Majesty back then. A hint of nostalgia flashed through Helena's eyes as she thought of some people. She thought of Her Majesty, who had gone through thick and thin with her people in that war-torn era. Back then, under the Tree of Life, they had an argument about freedom. In the end, she was the one who convinced the Queen, and the concept of family began to appear in the Wind Forest. What was freedom? That night, she had said to the Queen, how can you talk about freedom if you don't have power? Even now, she still insisted on her beliefs and ideas. However, standing here today, she did not want to repeat those words to Irina. Maybe she was really old. Or maybe it was because Irina was still as stubborn as a young girl. She was not the Queen who had experienced hundreds of years of racial wars. Since some principles did not make sense, there was no need to say them again. As for the freedom of those wandering elves, what did it have to do with her? The freedom she wanted was the freedom in this forest, the freedom to keep the enemy out of the forest. The distance between the forest and the enemy was the freedom she insisted on. The servants and slaves locked in cellars, prisons, and rooms, and the soldiers guarding the most dangerous borders also heard Irina's words. Tears flowed out from the corners of their eyes, slid down the glaring carvings on their faces, and dripped onto the ground. Rebels. What a disgusting word, but it was carved on their faces. Back then, they or their ancestors sacrificed their lives to protect the Wind Forest, and that was how the elves gained a foothold on the Norland continent. After the war ended, They chose to leave this place where their comrades and loved ones were buried. They went far away to find their own freedom, and used their wandering to forget those days of blood and fire. Then, they waited for the butcher's knife from their clansmen. Overnight, all the elves who left the Wind Forest were seen as traitors. The demons and orcs who had invaded the Wind Forest and massacred the elves were entrusted by the elves to pick up the butcher's knife again. The elves who wandered freely all over the continent were brutally besieged and killed. Those who were lucky enough to survive were tortured in all sorts of ways. They were either sold off at various underground auctions or sent back to the Wind Forest to become the slaves of various large families. This was the downfall of the wandering elves. The helpless elves had hoped that the kind queen would put an end to all this. But it didn't happen. The queen seemed to know nothing about it and had never even expressed any opinion on the matter. Or rather, this was the queen's order. No elves knew, because for the past few decades, Her Majesty the Queen had almost never appeared in front of the elves after the annual ceremony. The influence of the major families was growing, and in order to satisfy their desires, more and more mercenary groups were capturing elves. Their actions were also becoming more and more rampant. Faced with the large number of mercenary groups, the wandering elves were almost defenseless. They were escorted to the Wind Forest and labeled as traitors and dark magic casters. They were forced to undergo the so-called baptism of the water of life. The beautiful elves were chosen as personal servants, while the ordinary and old elves were engraved with the word traitor on their faces and became slaves. The elven code set layers of shackles on them. The strict hierarchy suppressed them at the bottom level. They were powerless to break free, and they didn't even dare to struggle. Perhaps there were elves who took pity on them and gave them a helping hand. And the most famous one who had done the most was Princess Irina, Wu Yi Wei. She wandered the Norland continent and targeted mercenary groups. In just a few years, she annihilated countless mercenary groups. She killed so many demons and orcs that they were terrified, and disappeared without a trace. Her appearance was like a ray of light in the hearts of the wandering elves. They had even begun to fantasize that if she became the queen of the Wind Forest one day, all of this would come to an end, and they would be able to cast off their identities as slaves and embark on their journey again in search of freedom. However, just 3 years ago, Alex was killed, and Irina also disappeared. The mercenary groups that had been in hiding for a long time appeared again, and continued to hunt down wandering elves in a frenzy. The ray of light was snuffed out, and everything returned to darkness and despair. However, 2 months ago, Irina appeared again. First, she killed Schubert and forced the queen to amend the elven code. Then, she killed Kobold of the Guidance mercenary squad and released all of the captured elves. Her words had spread throughout the Wind Forest, and they had been touched by her words. It turned out that there were still elves who understood their hearts. There were elves who still remembered the teachings of their ancestors, and knew what the elves were truly pursuing. What's that? Meg, who was searching for ducks on Warden Lake, turned toward the direction of the Wind Forest with a hint of surprise in his eyes. Right at this moment, 2 brightly colored ducks suddenly flew up from the nearby reeds. "I've finally found you." Meg's eyes lit up, and he swooped down onto his griffin before grabbing onto the neck of one of the ducks. The red-top tricolor duck was as fat as a swan, and it had a red head with 3 different colors smeared all over its body. As expected, it was extremely hideous. "RZ, turn around and go to the Wind Forest," Meg instructed in a grim voice as he strapped the duck onto his griffin's back. "Nonsense." Borge's enraged roar jolted everyone out of their reverie. All of the family leaders wore complex expressions on their faces, but they were extremely determined. No one was going to make them give up on the power and status that this power could bring them. What Irina wanted to do was to turn all of this upside down. As such, she was their enemy. Borge looked at the elders seated in the elder seating area with a solemn expression, and said in a deep voice, "Elders, the family leaders and I propose to remove Irina from her position and cripple her magic power. Please make a decision. The Bellman family is requesting that Irina be removed from her position. The Earhart family is requesting that Irina be removed from her position. Punish her severely." One family leader after another spoke up, requesting that Irina be removed from her position. This included both the 8 major families and normal small families, but almost half of them were requesting the removal of her position. Irina looked at all of the elves with a derisive sneer on her face. Chapter 845. Irina's actions are completely unbefitting of her status. She doesn't deserve to continue being the elven princess. I agree with her dismissal. I also agree with her dismissal. Irina has obstructed our plan to capture traitors on many occasions and killed our brethren for no reason. Her magic should be abolished as a punishment. I agree with her dismissal. Her actions are no different from that of a demon. She should be suppressed. I don't agree with her dismissal. The princess is the queen's successor, so Her Majesty should be the one to make the decision. How can she be dismissed so carelessly? The elders of the panel of elders voted one after another. Helena remained silent the entire time. Her face was completely expressionless, making it impossible to guess what she was thinking. Voices of agreement rang out incessantly, while voices of dissent died down. All of the elves below the stage looked on in silence. The outcome was already decided, but no one knew what kind of impact this outcome would have. 5 days ago, Irina was ambushed by 6 10th-tier powerhouses in Rodu, and she killed 3 of them. Immediately thereafter, Alex appeared and killed the remaining 3 10th-tier powerhouses as well as Benson before escaping unscathed. Even though Borg and Helena were both present, and there were more than 6 10th-tier elven powerhouses present, there was still a faint sense of unease in everyone's hearts. Furthermore, Irina was the princess of the elven race, after all. She had always been seen as the hope and pillar of the elven race for the next 1,000 years. If she were to die or be crippled, the elven race would essentially be cutting off an arm of their own. Where would they go from here on out? Irina was going to overthrow the family system and restore the ancient system. She was standing against all of the major families. What would happen to the elven race if they were to lose her in the future? This was a heavy question that weighed heavily on all of the elves' hearts. What made all of the elves who truly stood at the top of the hierarchy uneasy was that if Irina were to be killed, how would the elven race face the insane Alex? Normal elves might not know what the relationship between Irina and Alex was, but they knew that Irina's sudden return 3 years ago and her weakened state was actually because she had given birth to Alex's child. It was exactly because of this that the shocking ambush on that rainy night had taken place. Now, Alex wasn't dead, and he had returned with the lives of 4 10th-tier powerhouses. That was a man who was so powerful that it made people fear him. If he were to face the elves, it would definitely be a disaster. The young elves looked at Irina, who was standing behind the spring of life with her hands clasped behind her back. She was still the proud and powerful princess. She was the white moonlight in the hearts of many elves. They didn't dare to blaspheme her, nor did they have the slightest hatred for her. In the past, they could only look up at her back and listen to her stories as if they were legends. But now, they seemed to understand what she had been doing all this time. She climbed the Magus Tower to write her name, left the Forest of Wind, traveled the Norland continent, hunted down demons and orcs, fought with giant dragons, helped rebels. All the powerful and rebellious legends were just the freedom she was pursuing. This definition of freedom was something they had never thought about before. The things that they took for granted, the slaves with ugly words carved on their faces, the slaves that they used to laugh at, began to change in their hearts. It was like a seed that was slowly germinating. The elder who was also standing at the very center stood up, and said in a loud voice, "There are 8 elders who agree to remove Irina from the position of princess and punish her, while there are 3 elders who oppose this decision." Thus, the majority of the elders agree to remove Irina from the position of princess, and demote her to a commoner with immediate effect. At the same time, she will take responsibility for the deaths of Schubert and Colby. Her brain region will be destroyed, and she will be imprisoned in the Tower of Death for all eternity. Everyone fell silent. Even though the results had been achieved according to their wishes, even the leaders of the 8 major families had shut their mouths as they looked at Irina with cautious expressions. She wasn't a weak little girl. Instead, she was a powerful being who could kill 3 10th-tier powerhouses in an ambush. More importantly, this time, the Tree of Life was right behind her. Irina looked at the elders of the panel of elders, and she wasn't fearful in the slightest. Instead, she was slightly disappointed as she said, "You're the worst panel of elders I've ever seen." The elder, who was over 900 years old, reflexively took a step back, and all of the other elders also avoided Irina's gaze, not daring to look directly into her eyes. Irina shifted her gaze away from all of the elders and cast her gaze toward the elves below the stage. She then looked past them into the distance. "My brethren, I hope you can find your kind and gentle hearts. I hope you can become friends with trees, flowers, and birds. I hope you can use your hearts to experience and accept everything that you encounter and become true elves instead of demons in elven skin. I hope that everything I'm doing isn't just a one-man show. I hope that all of you who are being persecuted can pick up your weapons and unite to defend your freedom. I'll be your guide." A warm voice rang out throughout the wind forest, and a burst of golden light erupted from Irina's body, as if a golden veil had been draped over her body. The tree of life also lit up, and countless branches extended out of the cave, scattering specks of green light as they protected Irina like fireflies. How arrogant! I'm going to enforce the law on behalf of the panel of elders and seek justice for Schubert and Colby. Borge's brows furrowed, and a black wand had already appeared in his hand. He raised a finger, and a beam of black light had already silently shot forth toward Irina. The beam of black light split into 3 in mid-air, and then from 3 to 9. They transformed into 9 3-meter-long cheetahs that pounced toward Irina. Their menacing fangs and sharp claws left a trail of afterimages in their wake, and they were moving at a terrifying speed that even the naked eye couldn't follow. Holy light purification. Irina's staff also appeared in her hand, and she looked on in a calm manner at the oncoming cheetahs. Golden light erupted from the crystal at the tip of her staff before abruptly erupting forth. A cylindrical pillar of golden light erupted forth, sweeping toward the oncoming cheetahs. They were like crystals that had been struck by bullets, and they were instantly destroyed. The entire sky was swept away, leaving behind only a white scar and a few wisps of black mist. The green light revolving around Irina's body seemed to have been provoked, and it instantly surged forth to crush the black mist. "What's that?" Irina's eyes narrowed slightly with a hint of confusion. "What's that?" A hint of light also appeared in Helena's eyes, and a grave expression appeared on her face. Borge raised his wand high into the air, and his robes billowed in the wind as he roared, "All traitors will be punished, regardless of their status." The sky instantly darkened. Chapter 846. Irina's actions are completely unbefitting of her status. She doesn't deserve to continue being the elven princess. I agree to dismiss her. I also agree to dismiss her. Irina has obstructed our elven race's plan to capture the traitors on many occasions, and she has killed our brethren for no reason. Her magic should be abolished as a punishment. I agree to dismiss her. Her actions are no different from those of the devil, and she should be suppressed. I disagree to dismiss her. The princess is the queen's successor, so Her Majesty should be the one to decide. How can she be dismissed so hastily? The elders of the panel of elders voted one after another, and Helena remained silent the entire time. There wasn't even a hint of expression on her face, and no one could guess what she was thinking. The voices of agreement rang out incessantly, and the voices of opposition gradually faded away. All of the elves below the stage looked on in silence. There was no longer any suspense in the outcome, but no one knew what kind of impact this outcome would have. 5 days ago, Irina had been ambushed by 6 10th-tier powerful beings in Rodu, and she had killed 3 of them. Immediately thereafter, Alex had appeared and killed the remaining 3 10th-tier powerful beings as well as Benson before escaping unscathed. Borge and Helena were both present, and there were more than 6 10th-tier powerful beings present, but everyone was still struck by a sense of unease. Furthermore, Irina was the princess of the elven race, and she had always been viewed as the hope and pillar of the elven race for the next 1,000 years. If she were to die or be crippled, the elven race would essentially be crippled. What would happen to them in the future? Irina was going to overthrow the family system and restore the ancient system. She was going to oppose all of the major families. Without her, where would the elves go in the future when their queen was getting weaker day by day? This was a heavy question that weighed heavily on all of the elves' hearts. What was even more unsettling to the high-ranking elves was how the elven race was going to face a crazed Alex if Irina were to be killed. Normal elves didn't know what the relationship between Irina and Alex was, but they were well aware that Irina had suddenly returned 3 years ago and become feeble because she had given birth to a child for Alex. It was exactly because of this that the ambush that had taken place on that rainy night had shocked the entire continent. However, Alex hadn't died, and he had returned with the lives of 4 10th-tier powerful beings. He was a man who was so powerful that he struck fear into everyone's hearts. If he were to face off against the elven race, it would definitely be a disaster. All of the young elves looked at Irina, who was standing behind the spring of life with her hands clasped behind her back. She was still that proud and powerful princess, and they didn't dare to desecrate her, nor could they muster up any resentment toward her. In the past, they could only look up at her from behind and listen to her stories as legends. However, they now seemed to be beginning to understand what she had been doing all this time. She had ascended to the Magus Tower, left the Wind Forest, traveled the Norland continent, hunted down demons and orcs, battled giant dragons, and helped rebels. All of these powerful and rebellious legends were nothing more than the freedom that she was pursuing. This was a definition of freedom that they had never considered before. The things that they had taken for granted, the ugly words that had been carved into their faces, and the slaves that they had once mocked with abandon, began to change in their hearts. It was like a seed that was slowly sprouting. The elder standing at the very center rose to his feet, and announced in a loud voice, "There are 8 elders in favor of removing Irina from her position as the princess, while there are 3 elders in opposition. As such, the majority of the elders have voted in favor of removing Irina from her position as the princess and immediately demoting her to a commoner. At the same time, she will be held responsible for the deaths of Schubert and Koble, and her brain regions will be crippled, and she will be imprisoned in the Tower of Death forever." The entire hall fell completely silent. Even though the results had already been achieved according to their expectations, even the leaders of the 8 major families had fallen silent as they appraised Irina with cautious expressions. She was no frail little girl. Instead, she was a powerful being who had killed 3 10th-tier powerful beings during an ambush. More importantly, this time, the Tree of Life was right behind her. Irina looked at the elders with no fear in her eyes. She was just a little disappointed as she said, "You're the weakest group of elders I've ever seen." The elder, who was over 900 years old, took a step back reflexively. The other elders also avoided Irina's gaze as they didn't dare to look her in the eye. Irina shifted her gaze away from the elders and looked at the elves below the stage. She then looked past them and into the distance. "My people, I hope that you can find your gentle and kind hearts again. I hope that you can befriend trees, flowers, fishes, and birds. I hope that you can use your hearts to feel and accept everything that you encounter. I hope that you can become a true elf instead of a demon in an elf's skin. I hope that everything that I've done is not just a one-sided show. I hope that all of you who have been persecuted can pick up your weapons and unite together to defend your freedom, and I will guide all of you in the right direction." Her warm voice spread throughout the entire Wind Forest. A burst of faint golden light lit up from Irina's body, as if a golden veil had been draped over her body. The Tree of Life also lit up, and countless branches extended from above the cave, sprinkling specks of green light down like fireflies to protect Irina. "How dare you! I'm going to uphold justice for Schubert and Colby on behalf of the panel of elders." Borge's brows furrowed as a black wand appeared in his hand. He raised a finger, and a beam of black light shot forth soundlessly toward Irina. The beam of black light split into 3 in mid-air, then into 9, before transforming into 9 ferocious cheetahs that were around 3 meters in length before pouncing toward Irina. Their menacing fangs and sharp claws flashed with a cold light. They were so fast that even the naked eye couldn't keep up with them. "Holy light, purify." Irina also summoned her staff, and she looked at the oncoming cheetahs with a calm expression. Golden light lit up from the crystal at the tip of her staff before abruptly erupting forward. A cylindrical pillar of golden light erupted forth, engulfing the oncoming cheetahs. It was as if a crystal had been struck by a bullet, and it was instantly pulverized. The entire sky was swept away, leaving only a white streak and a few wisps of ethereal black mist in its wake. The green light revolving around Irina seemed to have been stimulated, and it instantly surged upward to crush the wisps of black mist. What's that? Irina's eyes narrowed slightly as a hint of confusion appeared on her face. What's that? A hint of excitement also appeared in Helena's eyes, and a grim expression appeared on her face. Borge raised his wand high into the air, and his magician robes fluttered in the wind as he yelled, "All traitors will be punished regardless of their status or identity." The sky instantly darkened. Chapter 847. Deathly silence ensued in front of the cave, and all of the elves wore expressions of horror on their faces. There was clearly only one person standing in front of them, but that threat felt as if the heavens had fallen upon them, and all of the elves felt as if they were suffocating. After being rumored to have been dead for 3 years, Alex, who was hailed as the most powerful man on the surface of the earth, still possessed terrifying power. He didn't even have to attack, and his griffin alone was enough to severely wound Borge, who was rumored to have once fought to a draw with him. The events that had transpired today were completely beyond the expectations of the normal elves. Irina was dethroned from her position as princess, and then engaged in a fierce battle with Borge with the assistance of the Tree of Life. Immediately thereafter, Alex appeared, severely wounded Borge, and saved Irina. The plot was far too unconventional, and most of the elves were uncomfortable with this development. The entrance to the cave had been sealed off by a cloud of green light, making it impossible to see what was going on inside. The life force energy that normally flowed out of the cave had been completely cut off, as if it had been sealed off by an invisible wall. The Tree of Life seemed to have completely severed its connection with the outside world, and even that gentle green light had completely disappeared. The Spring of Life is gone. Right at this moment, an elf yelled in a panicked voice. All of the elves were startled to hear this, and all of them turned toward the Spring of Life. The Spring of Life that had been gushing out of the Spring of Life had completely fallen silent. At this moment, there was only one pool of clear spring water left. At the bottom of the pool, there was a dark cave. All of the spring water had disappeared without a trace. What do we do? The Great Elder looked at the completely dried up Spring of Life with a panicked expression. The Spring of Life has dried up. That's a very bad omen. This is a very bad omen. An elderly elf yelled in a hoarse voice with a hint of horror in his voice. All of the elves wore expressions of horror and unease. Their queen had suddenly gone into seclusion, Princess Irina had been dethroned, the Tree of Life had severed its connection with the outside world, and the Spring of Life had dried up. All of these things had happened in the past 2 days, and it seemed as if a layer of haze had been cast over the hearts of all of the elves. I've heard that the Spring of Life has dried up 3 times in the history of the elves. Each time it appeared, the elves would face a great disaster. The last time it dried up was more than 1,000 years ago. After that, 1,000 years of racial war began. A weak voice sounded from the crowd. Uneasiness began to spread through the crowd. All of the elves turned toward Borge and Helena, who was standing on the platform with a grave expression on her face. The queen was in seclusion, and the princess had been crippled, so these two were the most powerful beings in the elven race. As for the panel of elders, all of the elves were well aware that half of them were Borge's subordinates, while the other half were Helena's subordinates. In the end, the 2 of them would still be the ones making the final decisions. The terrifying wound on Borge's shoulder had already stopped bleeding and healed, but his tattered clothes and blood-stained clothes made him look rather disheveled. With a ferocious look in his eyes, he shook off the hand of the elf who was supporting him and took a few steps forward. He pointed a finger in the direction of the cave with a sinister expression, and said, "It must be that witch Irina who caused the Spring of Life to dry up. We have to catch her and kill her, only then can we get rid of the omen. Yes. We have to kill Irina." The leader of the Bearman family was the first to chime in. Even though the leaders of Borge's family were rather hesitant, they still chimed in one after another. At this moment, all of the ordinary elves were in a state of panic and didn't dare to say anything. Everything that had happened seemed to indicate that something bad was about to happen. If they killed Irina now, who would be able to stop Alex from returning? Borge? No, He clearly couldn't. However, who would be able to stop Borge, who had already gone insane? All of the elves looked on as Borge and the powerful beings behind him slowly made their way toward the cave, and no one dared to say anything. Kill Irina. Get rid of the omen. All of the elves who supported Borge yelled in unison as they made their way toward the cave in an enraged manner. Among them were Borge's followers, as well as elves who were fearful of the dire consequences that could befall them if the spring of life were to dry up. Compared to the potential for the elven race to fall into an abyss of suffering, Alex didn't seem all that terrifying. All of the other elves looked on in silence with perplexed expressions. Break the seal and kill her. Borge stood in front of the cave and pointed at the green seal with a deranged expression. Kill her. All of the other elves also raised their wands with frenzied expressions as they pointed them toward the cave. Light of different colors appeared on the wands, and there was no lack of 10th-tier magic casters among them. With so many magic casters attacking at once, there was no way that the seal would be able to withstand their combined might. Some of the elves closed their eyes in sympathy. Regardless of whether it was Princess Irina or the Tree of Life, none of them could bear to see them die like this. Right at this moment, a figure silently appeared at the entrance of the cave and stood in front of everyone. It was none other than Helena, who had remained silent throughout this entire process. She stood at the entrance of the cave and looked on calmly at all of the elves. All of the elves who were about to unleash their spells all stopped in a panicked manner, and some of them turned to look at Helena with confusion and panic in their eyes. What was the High Priestess doing? Borge's expression also stiffened upon seeing this, and his brows furrowed as he asked, "What are you doing, High Priestess? Borge, do you want to become the enemy of the entire elven race?" Helena looked at Borge with a serious expression as she said, "The elven ancestors have decreed that anyone who destroys the Tree of Life and the Spring of Life will become the enemy of the entire race. You've already damaged the essence of the Tree of Life during your battle with Irina, and you're trying to break the barrier around the Tree of Life by force. Are you trying to kill the Tree of Life?" Helena turned to the elves behind Borge and said in a grim voice, "The Tree of Life's offensive and defensive capabilities are both extremely weak. This barrier was materialized from the Tree of Life's essence, and if you try to break it by force, the Tree of Life won't be far from death. Do you want to become the murderers of the Tree of Life?" All of the elves' expressions changed drastically upon hearing this, and they all put down their wands in a panic. Killing Irina and killing the Tree of Life were two completely different matters. That wasn't something that they could take responsibility for, not even Borge. The elven magic originated from the Tree of Life, and it was the spokesperson of the goddess of life in this world. If they killed it, the elven race would most likely be abandoned by the goddess of life, and they would become the sinners of the entire elven race. Borge looked at Helena with a conflicted expression, but he still relaxed his clenched fists in the end, and said, "I only want to punish Irina for causing all of this, and I have the utmost respect for the Tree of Life. However, seeing as the High Priestess has said that doing so will harm the Tree of Life, I have no intention of doing so. I still need to treat my injuries, so please continue presiding over the ceremony. I'll be taking my leave now." Borge cast a meaningful glance toward the cave before turning to depart. The interests of the elven race take precedence over everything. "No one can cross this line," Helena said in a calm voice as she looked at Borge's departing figure. Chapter 848. The whistling wind blew past the griffin, making the man and the fairy sitting atop it seem rather silent. Alice, whose eyes were red from crying, sat at the back. Her tears continued to flow down her cheeks and drip onto her clothes. However, she didn't cry at all. With teary eyes, she looked at the man, who was wearing a black robe and was sitting in front of her, as straight as a sword. His clothes were fluttering in the wind, and she could only see half of his black and white mask. She didn't know what kind of face was hidden under that mask, but that mask gave off an unapproachable feeling, so much so that she didn't even dare to make a sound. This man was the man that the princess had been longing for, and he was also the man who had once driven her crazy. He was also the man who had given birth to a baby with her. Alice had heard countless legends about him. Even though he was only a human, he had become a hero in the hearts of all the young women in the world. However, Alice didn't care about all of this. In fact, she even hated him a little. It was because of him that the princess had almost died 3 years ago. It was because of him that the princess had become a thorn in the side of so many people. It was because of him that the princess had been deposed from her position as the princess today. And just now, he actually left the princess behind and ran away with her. How could a man like him be worthy of the princess? She wanted to go back. Even though her power was insignificant, she still wanted to stay by the princess's side, even if it meant that she could only block an insignificant spell for her. However, she couldn't see the wind forest anymore. She had never left the forest in her entire life, and if she were to go back now, she wouldn't even be able to find her way. As such, her resentment toward the man in front of her deepened even further. A real man would never abandon his woman and run away, not to mention that he was a powerful Griffin Knight. "Do you hate me?" Meg turned around and looked at the weeping Alice. His gaze lingered on her eyes for a moment before he asked in a calm manner. Alice's heart trembled slightly at the sight of those eyes, and she was a little scared. No matter how much resentment she felt, this was still a man who could send Borge flying with the help of a griffin. However, at the thought of the princess, she couldn't help but turn to Meg as she asked, "Why didn't you take the princess with you? Do you know how long she waited for you? How could you bear to leave her there alone? They've gone crazy, and they'll kill the princess. You bastard." Meg looked at the hysterical Alice and smiled bitterly. She was just a little maid. She knew who he was, but she still dared to talk to him like that. She knew that she would die, but she was still willing to stay and accompany Irina. But he couldn't. He respected Irina's choice to stay because he didn't have the strength to forcefully take her out of the encirclement. He didn't even dare to stay for long in case he was exposed. Right now, he was just a paper tiger that could be broken with a single poke. Maintaining a sense of mystery had instead become his weapon, which could achieve a certain degree of deterrence. Although he felt that Irina was a smart woman who knew how to protect herself, as Alice said, he was indeed a bastard who left Irina alone. He was even worse than a maid who accompanied her. Because he wanted to go back alive, Amy was still waiting for him at home. He let go of all the hot-blooded thoughts and calmly thought about what he should do and what he shouldn't do now. What he wanted was not a momentary impulse, but a long and stable life. "She'll be fine, I'll get her out of here." Meg looked at Alice, and his voice softened slightly as he said, "I'm going to take you to Chaos City now. You'll be protected there, and you'll find a way to survive. I'll go back to the Wind Forest and protect the princess." Alice looked at Meg with a determined expression. "If you don't want her to be hurt because of you, then it's best that you don't do that," Meg said in a calm voice before turning away and falling silent. He was still standing on the griffin's back like a long sword. Alice's mouth gaped open slightly as she looked at Meg's departing figure, but she was unable to say anything else. She turned back toward the direction that they had come from, and tears began to flow from her eyes like pearls from a broken necklace. "Princess. I'm so useless. She'll be fine, right?" Meg also looked into the distance with a hint of concern in his heart. His long sword was standing beside him, and the 2 red-top tricolor ducks that were still struggling beside his left foot were quite eye-catching. Even Alice, whose eyes were slightly swollen from crying, couldn't help but be drawn to the 2 ugly ducks after ascertaining that she wouldn't be able to fly down from the sky, and that she would only be a burden to Meg if she went back. She thought to herself, why did he catch 2 such ugly ducks? Where's the little mistress? Could it be that he's bringing these 2 ducks back for the little mistress to eat? Do they live in Chaos City? If I can't take care of the princess, then can I take care of the little mistress? However, Meg had no intention of explaining himself. In fact, he didn't even say anything along the way. They flew for 2 hours, and a majestic city appeared in their field of vision, following which the griffin began to descend. After hesitating for a long while, Alice looked at Meg's departing figure, and mustered up her courage as she asked, Can I take care of the little mistress?" Meg turned to look at Alice with a hint of surprise in his eyes. The little girl was looking at him with an expectant and pleading expression, and her frail body seemed to be filled with energy. "No." Meg's reply was quick and decisive. Alice's expression immediately darkened, and the tears that had just stopped welled up in her eyes again. "I'm going to test you for a while. If you can survive in Chaos City, then perhaps I'll give you a chance. I won't hand my daughter over to someone who can't take care of herself." Meg's calm voice sounded again. Alice's eyes lit up again, and she looked at Meg with a serious expression as she said, "I'll do my best. I'm going to live a good life in Chaos City." Mag nodded slightly. He turned around and steered the griffin downward. "Down below, in Chaos City. Look. What's that? That looks like a griffin, right? But why isn't it stopping outside the city? But this griffin looks a little strange. Does it have purple stripes?" "Purple stripes. Purple stripes. A purple-striped griffin. Could that be Alex?" "It's him. There's only one purple-striped griffin in this world. It has to be Alex." Chaos City. Instantly, everyone looked up at the griffin that was swooping down from the sky with excitement on their faces. "Be on guard." The soldiers on the city wall of Chaos City became a little nervous as they gripped their spears tightly. They didn't know the purpose of the griffin's arrival. The griffin landed on the city wall. Meg stood up and said to Alice, "Go. Millimeter HM." Alice nodded solemnly before carefully sliding down from the griffin's wing. Meg looked around at the wary soldiers and countless pairs of eyes that were looking up at him, and solemnly said, "Let's go." Chapter 849. The revolving black passageway extended endlessly into the ground, as if it were trying to burrow into the core of the earth. At the end of the passageway, a tall and broad figure stood within a cavernous cave. There was a ball of dark green netherfire hovering before him, and the green light shimmering on his face made his sinister features appear even more menacing. "Didn't you say that you'd bestow me with immense power if I handed over my soul? Why was it so difficult for me to even defeat Irina? Even Alex's steed was able to send me flying with ease. Were you lying to me?" Borge was unable to conceal the rage on his face as he glared at the ghostly flames with wide eyes. The ball of dark green netherfire twisted and warped before transforming into a human skull, and it said in a bewitching voice, "Don't panic, everything is under our control. If you had used necromancy magic during the battle, you would have lost everything if those idiots had discovered it. As such, we didn't choose to help you at that time. However, we've already successfully infiltrated the Tree of Life, so all we have to do now is take complete control of the Tree of Life, then use it to control the Elven Queen and Irina. Everything in the Elven race will be yours, including the two of them. When that time comes, you'll be the only king of the Elven race, as well as the only male king in the history of the Elven race." The human skull's bewitching voice reverberated throughout the cave, and the fury on Borge's face gradually faded. A peculiar smile appeared on his face as wisps of dark green light appeared deep within his eyes. "I'm going to become the king of the Elven race. Only I deserve to be the king of the Elven race. You're injured, let us heal you." Necromancy magic doesn't just represent death, it actually possesses life force that even life magic can't compare with. The human skull's coarse voice reverberated throughout the cave, and wisps of dark green light surged toward Borge from within the human skull. The dark green light in his eyes gradually deepened. At the same time, the grass in the territory of the Segat family almost instantly withered, and the moist branches of the trees seemed to have shrunk, but no one noticed this. "What's that sinister aura in Borge's magic? It seems to be different from before, but I can't quite put my finger on it. It's like a special type of power. What is that?" In the starry cave abode, Helena looked up at the bright star in the sky with furrowed brows. "Heidi, take my astrolabe." Helena's voice abruptly trailed off as she looked down at the empty cave, and fell silent again. The princess has been dethroned, and Mistress Helena has also expressed her attitude. This might be an opportunity for our two families. The Bybilly family will fully support Miss Sally to become the new Elven princess. In a secret chamber, Vincent looked into Elliot's eyes, and said, "As a condition, I hope family leader Elliot can promise me that if young Mistress Sally becomes the Elven Queen in the future, the Bybilly family will become the #1 family below the Brewster family." Elliot looked into Vincent's eyes. After a moment of silence, he nodded solemnly. "If that day really comes, The Brewster family will definitely not forget the Billy family's kindness. A smile appeared on Vincent's face as he nodded, and said, "All right, looks like I have to make a trip to Chaos City in person. Don't wait any longer, uncles. Mr. Mac has gone out to gather materials, and will only reopen tomorrow. You can come back tomorrow." At the entrance of Mammoth, a young man consoled the two strange-looking uncles who were standing in front of the door with widened eyes and dejected expressions on their faces. The two uncles' clothes were in tatters, and their bodies were riddled with wounds. At first glance, one would think that they had just crawled out of a primordial forest. However, judging from the sorrowful expressions on their faces, it was clear that they had heard of Mammoth. Only regular customers would show such a grief-stricken expression when they saw such an evil announcement. Ah, heavens, earth. I've gone through 81 ordeals to get here, so how can Mr. Mac not be here? This is too much. Abraham looked up at the sky with a grief-stricken expression as tears streamed down his face. It took them an entire night to crawl out of the canyon again, and they were only brought to Chaos City by a passing merchant caravan when the sun came up. They had thought that their suffering was over, but who would have thought that they would be dealt such a heavy blow? Abraham's body swayed, and he almost fell over. The beast tamer beside him hurriedly extended a hand to support him, and lowered his head in shame, not daring to say anything. He had already mentally prepared himself. It would be a miracle if he didn't lose his head after returning from this trip to Chaos City. He would definitely lose his job. This bloody lesson was going to be a classic case in the world of beast tamers. A beast tamer had to have absolute control over the feeding of their steeds. Otherwise, their masters could feed an eagle until it became a pig. Meg's arrival at Chaos City and his public announcement that he was going to punish the groups that had captured the wandering elves drew countless attention. The purple-striped griffin that was shimmering with a purple-golden light struck everyone with awe and veneration, while the man standing on the griffin's back drew countless reverent gazes. Chaos City had only just announced that it was protecting the wandering elves. Who would have thought that Master Alex would appear in Chaos City and announce that he's going to punish the groups and individuals that have harmed the wandering elves? Is this just a coincidence? Could it be that Alex has already joined Chaos City? Or is it because of the Elven Princess? I only heard that Alex was still alive a few days ago. Who would have thought that he would appear in Chaos City again? I can brag about this for an entire year. Ara. He's so handsome. Even though he's wearing a mask, I feel like I can't even close my legs just by standing there. Please watch your language, uncle. Chaos City erupted into an uproar as everyone rushed out of their houses toward the northern part of the city. They wanted to catch a glimpse of the legendary dragon-slaying warrior. Alex. Interesting. In the City Lord's castle, Michael looked toward the northern part of the city with a hint of surprise on his face. That guy also came to Chaos City. In Chaos School, Crassus was also looking toward the northern part of the city with a slightly entranced expression. Boom. A fireball exploded in front of Crassus, instantly engulfing his newly grown beard. Chapter 850. Amy shrugged with an innocent expression, and said, "Master Shortbeard, you said that I can't be distracted during magic practice." Crassus looked at the innocent expression on Amy's little face. She was so adorable, and he really couldn't do anything about it. Besides, he really had been distracted just then. That damned Alex. I'm going to make him compensate me with a jug of good wine next time I see him, Crassus thought to himself with a vexed expression. Alex. Conti Nicholas, will definitely become a dragon-slaying warrior like you. An excited and fanatical voice sounded from below the city wall. A fully armored donkey-riding knight looked up at Meg with excitement on his face. Everyone burst into laughter at the sight of this strange combination. No matter how they looked at it, this donkey-riding knight didn't look like someone who could slay a dragon. Meg was just about to leave, and he looked down with a hint of surprise. Conti's smile was still as bright as ever, and didn't change in the slightest despite the laughter around him. Nice mount, Conti Nicholas. I'll remember that. I hope that when I hear your name again in the future, I'll have those words in front of it. Meg looked at Conti with a smile before taking a glance at Firis. The griffin spread its wings and disappeared into the distance. Everyone instantly fell silent. They were all staring at Conti with incredulity. That knight riding a black donkey with a sapphire long sword hanging from his waist had received Alex's approval. Could it be that this guy had some other powerful abilities? Definitely. Conti looked in the direction that the griffin had disappeared, and his smile became even more confident. He then turned around and rode away on his donkey. After Alex left, the onlookers also gradually dispersed. However, Alex's arrival in Chaos City and his public announcement were clearly going to be a hot topic for the residents of Chaos City for some time. Firis withdrew her gaze and looked at the wary soldiers who had gathered around her. She calmly said, "I want to seek protection from Chaos City. Please come with me to the City Lord's castle." A soldier who appeared to be a captain made his way over to Firis. Phyllis nodded and followed the captain down the city wall towards the City Lord's mansion. "Don't worry, young mistress. I'll be sure to live a good life in Chaos City and take good care of the young mistress. I'll wait for you to come and find us," Firis thought to herself. Just as Chaos City was still reeling from the surprise of Alex's arrival, Meg, who had changed back into his normal clothes, was riding his bicycle along a mountain path. His two red-top tricolor ducks were hanging off the handlebars of his bicycle, and their eyes were rolling up like two rainbows. Meg's performance just now wasn't a sudden whim. He really did want to do something to support Gloria and at the same time relieve some of the pressure she was facing. His declaration, coupled with the official announcement of Chaos City, should be able to intimidate those mercenary squads to some extent, and create a safe environment for all of the wandering elves who sought refuge in Chaos City. Chaos City had opened a door for all of the wandering elves, and at the same time, it had thrown out an extremely attractive bait for those mercenary squads. If he and Chaos City didn't do something, all of the wandering elves scattered across the continent would most likely suffer even more. It's time to switch the roles of the predator and the prey in this hunting game, Meg murmured to himself. He looked at the red-top tricolor ducks hanging off the handlebars of his bicycle, and his mood immediately improved. He said internally, "System, I've captured 2 red-top tricolor ducks. I've completed the mission, right? Congratulations, you've successfully captured 2 red-top tricolor ducks within the time limit. You've completed the mission and received a Quanjude Peking duck recipe, as well as all of the necessary cooking utensils." The system's voice sounded. Meg looked at the shiny golden experience bag that had appeared in his mind, and a vibrant smile appeared on his face. Speaking of Peking duck, it really was one of Meg's favorite dishes. The Bienni Square roast duck and the Quanjude roast duck had different flavors, but Meg still preferred the Quanjude roast duck. The Bienni Square was the first roast duck restaurant in Beijing, and it had a history of over 600 years. The so-called Bienni Square roast duck was a restaurant that didn't have an open flame, so the roast duck couldn't be moved in the middle of the cooking process. The roast duck made by a good chef had a crispy outer skin, a plump inner layer, and a juicy inner layer. In contrast, the Quanjude roast duck was roasted by hanging the duck over an open flame, thereby earning it its name. It was a roast duck in the truest sense of the word, and it had successfully made Peking duck a famous dish. As for Da Dong and the Sea Sky Pavilion, those were roast duck restaurants that had become quite popular in recent years, but Meg only tried them once in a while. His favorite dish was still the Quanjude restaurant's traditional roast duck. However, a few years ago, when Quanjude changed to electric roast duck, the soulless duck disappointed Meg greatly. Since then, he rarely went to Quanjude restaurant. The main reason why Meg was so tempted was that the system had promised that the roast duck recipe would be a traditional roast duck recipe, and not an electric roast duck recipe. Just thinking about how he could make the perfect Quanjude roast duck with his own hands made Meg excited. Meg rode his bicycle back to the city gate in a low-key manner. When he heard the passers-by discussing the arrival of Alex, he couldn't help but smile. If these people knew that he was Alex, they would probably break down. "Dragon!" At this moment, someone at the city gate suddenly exclaimed. Meg looked up and saw a somewhat familiar frost dragon flying over from afar. It landed and transformed into a human form, and the cold aura it exuded made the passers-by avoid it. "It's her." Meg was slightly surprised to see Elizabeth in her crystalline dress. This wasn't the first time that he had been struck by fear in the face of a giant dragon. Furthermore, this young woman would occasionally come to the restaurant to dine, and she seemed to be very interested in MIA. She had left a deep impression on him. Elizabeth also took a glance at Meg, but didn't greet him. Instead, she walked right past him. However, just as she reached the city gate, her ears twitched, and she suddenly stopped in her tracks. She turned her cold gaze to a portly middle-aged man, and asked in a cold voice, "Did you just say that Alex came to Chaos City?" The middle-aged man was just an ordinary businessman, and he was instantly plunged into an icy abyss by Elizabeth's glare. Even his voice was trembling as he replied, He just came, but he already left. Where did he go?" Elizabeth immediately clenched her fists. Her voice became even colder, and frost had already appeared beneath her feet. I don't know either." The merchant wanted to cry but had no tears. What kind of world was this? He was just bragging to his friends. Why was he being asked about Alex's whereabouts? He was just a cucumber seller. What could he know? Elizabeth withdrew her gaze, and a white snowflake appeared beneath her feet, and she disappeared on the spot. Chapter 851. In the City Lord's castle, Michael handed a document to Dicus, and said, "Give this document to the principal. The first batch of funds from Ms. Luna's foundation has already been received. The City Lord's castle is only involved in the supervision of the foundation, and will not interfere with any of its affairs. Also, the City Lord's castle will allocate funds to the foundation to target the increase of elven children in the near future. Hopefully, Chaos School will be able to arrange for more teachers and teaching sites to enroll the children as soon as possible." "All right." Dicus accepted the document with a solemn expression before quickly departing. "Make the necessary arrangements. I'm going to the Grey Temple headquarters." Michael instructed the employee standing at the entrance before also making his way out with a smile on his face. "Seeing as even Alex has spoken, we should also do something. If those bastards dare to set their sights on Chaos City, they'll have to pay the price." The black horse-drawn carriage departed from the City Lord's castle, and headed toward the Grey Temple headquarters in the western part of the city. The square grey stone palace was situated in the western part of Chaos City. The dark grey palace appeared to be quite solemn, and even the pedestrians walking on the streets beside the palace couldn't help but tread lightly in their footsteps. Everyone wore reverent expressions on their faces. The Grey Temple's existence restricted the actions of all of the residents of Chaos City, and also protected them from harm from the outside world. They represented the order of Chaos City, as well as the bottom line of Chaos City. A black horse-drawn carriage stopped at the gate, and Michael alighted from the carriage before making his way inside. In the grandest Grey Temple in the complex of buildings, an elderly elf in a long grey robe nodded at Michael. Michael looked at the elderly elf with a serious expression, and said, "Roland, the elven race is undergoing a drastic change, and Alex has reappeared. Perhaps we should do something." Meg paused to take a look at the Swede when he passed by the entrance of the store. There wasn't a single piece of clothing on display, and there was a sign hanging on the door that read, "New product in production. Please look forward to it." Even so, there were still beautiful ladies coming in and out, asking the staff for the exact time of the next new product. However, the staff would always apologetically say that they were not sure at the moment. Meg shook his head with a smile as he watched the rich ladies walk out of the store with melancholy expressions. He didn't expect Gloria to have started hunger marketing. Although the current situation was entirely due to the lack of production, the customers' attention was still on the rise. Now, all they needed to do was to increase the supply. Apart from high-end women's wear, industrialized low-end women's wear is also a sea of blue. However, the labor cost is too high at the moment. Once the steam engine is fully popularized, this industry will welcome a big reshuffle. Meg pedaled hard on the bicycle and headed toward the restaurant. With the Buffett family's enormous financial resources and the City Lord's mansion's skilled craftsmen working together, It shouldn't take too long for the steam engine to be popularized. Furthermore, the situation on the Norland continent was beginning to become very unstable, and the Buffett family was most likely in a hurry to secure more bargaining chips than anyone else. A bank business like this had extremely stringent requirements for stability. As such, Meg wasn't worried that the steam engine project would be delayed at all. Both the City Lord's mansion and the Buffett family were clearly very interested in this project. Beside a lake in the Buffett manor, Hill looked at Ian, who was sitting beside the lake with a fishing rod in his hand, and an excited expression appeared on her face as she said, "Grandfather, after 3 rounds of research, the think tank has basically confirmed that the emergence of the steam engine will completely change the current energy system and affect people's lives in all aspects. It's going to push the entire world forward, and it's going to be superior to all other energy sources in the past. Cheap coal will become an important resource. As the leader, the Buffett family will benefit immensely from this process." Ian looked up at Hill and carefully appraised her for a while before smiling as he said, "You rarely show any emotion, even in front of me. The last time you showed such emotion was when you were preparing to implement the savings system." A smile also appeared on Hill's face as she said, "Change is always exciting, and the unknown is always accompanied by opportunities. I'm not a fan of adventure, but I'm very interested in the unknown. However, ever since King Andre's birthday banquet, the situation on the Norland continent has become a little tricky. Alex didn't die, and he and Irina killed Benson and 6 10th-tier powerful beings from the 3 races. After that, Chaos City announced that it would protect the wandering elves. We just received news from the Wind Forest that the Elven Queen has gone into seclusion, and Irina has been deposed from her position as princess. Alex announced that he would fight for the wandering elves in Chaos City, which means that he and Chaos City are opposing the Wind Forest." A serious expression appeared on Hill's face as she said, "The peace treaty will be re-signed in 3 months, and it'll be very difficult for all of the races to reach a consensus. In fact, another war could erupt. How do you think this will affect the Buffett family?" Ian asked with a smile. The demons, orcs, and forest trolls, who originally had the initiative and wanted to cause trouble, lost more than a dozen level 10 masters 3 years ago and a while ago. Their strength has been greatly reduced. On the other hand, Alex is still alive, which means that they have gained a top-level combat power. They have turned the tables and taken the initiative. It is still unknown whether they will reunite with their former allies, the dwarfs and the elves. However, even if a large-scale war doesn't erupt in the near future, once the peace treaty is torn apart, border wars will be inevitable, and the relationship between all of the races will deteriorate rapidly. For our bank, that could be a disaster. The peace treaty that the bank has signed with all of the races could be unilaterally torn apart, and war could make it impossible for money to flow between all of the races. Our bank will become a stagnant pool of water. Hence, I think the most important thing now is to introduce steam locomotives and steam engines as soon as possible so that all races will be interested in them. When that time comes, the steam engine will become the most important bargaining chip of the Buffett family. It will open up a new channel for the bank, and even in the worst-case scenario, the steam engine will still be a bargaining chip to protect the Buffett family, Hill said with a solemn expression. "Do you know what the wisest decision I've ever made was ever since I decided to become a businessman?" Ian asked with a smile as he looked at Hill. "Establishing the Buffett banks." Hill asked after a moment of contemplation. "No, it was choosing you to become the successor of the Buffett family." Ian shook his head. "Father, what are these 2? Are they big ugly ducks?" Chapter 852. Well, that's about right. Meg looked at the 2 red-top tricolor ducks on the ground with their necks curled up together. In that case, Ugly Duckling really did fit their looks better. Meow Tilda Ugly Duckling was also looking on from the side with a curious expression. "Father, did you go to find Ugly Duckling's parents? They really do look just as ugly as Ugly Duckling." Amy's eyes immediately lit up, and she picked up Ugly Duckling before placing it beside the 2 ducks. She nodded, and said, "They really do look identical." Are they really identical?" Meg and Crassus, who had brought Amy back, Both raised their eyebrows in unison. That's right. We're a family, after all. Amy nodded with a pleased expression before looking up at Meg with anticipation in her eyes. Father, are we having roast duck tonight? Meow tilde ugly duckling was a little flustered as it tried to point its little paw at the two ducks, then at itself, as if it were trying to say that it didn't look like them at all. Amy pressed ugly duckling's little paw back down with a smile on her face. I know you're very happy that you've found your parents, and I'm also very happy for all of you. Let's celebrate tonight. Are you a demon? Ugly duckling stared at Amy with wide eyes as if it were looking at something terrifying. Meg couldn't help but burst into laughter at Amy's reaction. He turned to Crassus, and his gaze fell on his white beard, which was only about an inch long. A hint of surprise appeared on his face as he asked, "What happened to your beard, Master Crassus?" Crassus' beard was one of his most prized possessions. Back when Amy's fireball had burned off half of his beard, he had been heartbroken for a long time. He had taken great care of it, and it had grown back quite a bit. However, it had only been a day since he'd last seen it. Well, I heard that long beards aren't popular these days, so I'll try cutting it short. Crassus felt as if his heart were bleeding, but he still had to maintain a smile on his face. What could he do? He couldn't tell others that it had been burned off by his disciple. Short-bearded master, why did you cry when you were cutting it? Amy looked up and asked curiously. Those are tears of happiness. An awkward look appeared on Crassus' face, and he hurriedly changed the subject as he looked at the three-flower duck on the ground, and said, "Let's talk about the roast duck for dinner." Sure. Amy's interest was immediately piqued by the roast duck. After Meg's repeated explanations, the old man and the young man finally gave up the idea of roasting and eating the 3 ducks on the spot. Meg hadn't opened the experience bag yet, and he hadn't entered the test field for the god of cookery yet. Naturally, he couldn't make the authentic Quanjude roast duck. Meow meow tilde ugly duckling hid between the 2 ducks with an aggrieved expression, as if it had already admitted that it was a duck. At the same time, the 2 red-top tricolor ducks spread their wings and enveloped ugly duckling in their arms. This was a very harmonious scene. Meg made dinner for Amy and Crassus. After seeing Crassus off, Amy stood at the door and looked up at Meg with an expectant expression as she asked, "Father, can we go see Uncle Bluefatty's little sisters?" "Of course." Meg nodded with a smile. He didn't have to open for business that night, and he had an affinity with the twins, so he wanted to visit them as well. "Give me a moment, I have to prepare something." Meg turned and went into the kitchen. 15 minutes later, Meg arrived with Amy on his bicycle with a lunchbox and a small gift box in his hands. He had given Meg the address of Gyurge's house before, and Meg was able to successfully find it with Amy after asking around twice. "Mr. Mac, little boss, what are you doing here?" Gyurge quickly came out to greet them, and turned to Meg and Amy with a surprised expression. "Uncle Bluefatty, we're here to see our little sister," Remi said with a smile. Her eyes were full of curiosity as she looked into the courtyard. "Where is she?" "This Yangju fried rice is for Madam, and these 2 small gifts are for the 2 kids." Meg handed the 2 boxes to Gyurge with a smile. "Mr. Mac, you didn't have to bring any gifts. Please come in." Gyurge accepted the boxes, and turned to Amy with a smile as he said, "The little sisters are in there. Take Uncle Bluefatty to see them." 2 servants came out and carefully carried Meg's bicycle into the courtyard, while Meg and Amy followed Gyurge into the courtyard. Chaos City was considered a wealthy district. Although Chaos City was known for its equality, the gap between the rich and the poor didn't disappear because of equality. Gyurge's family had a few profitable workshops and shops, but they could only be considered a middle-class family, and naturally couldn't compare with the Buffett family, who had a lot of manners. However, the well-proportioned houses and exquisite garden were still a testament to the wealth of this middle-class family and the beauty of the mistress of the house. A little boy who was about 3 years old ran toward Amy and opened his little arms as he mumbled, "Big sister. Big sister. I want a hug. I want to raise it up high. Do you think you'll become cute if you call me Big Sister?" Amy asked calmly. Parber stopped in his tracks with his little arms still raised, and looked at Amy with a perplexed expression. "No, You still haven't become a cute little sister. I hope you know that. Amy shook her head, and then walked past Parba in a suave manner without any hesitation. Big sister won't hug me. War. Parba pouted, and began to cry with indignation. Ha, don't cry, Parba. Let's go see your little brother and little sister. Gyurge hurriedly squatted down to pick Parba up, and consoled him. I'm sorry, Amy, Meg said apologetically. Gyurge shook his head with a smile, and said, Mr. Mac, you don't have to apologize. I know little boss is a kind girl, and she only likes little sisters. They arrived outside a room. Miranda was still recovering from her confinement, so Meg naturally couldn't go in, so only Amy followed him into the room. Wow. What a cute little sister. I want to hug her, can I? After a short while, Amy's elated voice sounded from the room. War, big sister wants to hug little sister, but not me. War, I want to become a little sister too. Parba's aggrieved voice also sounded from the room. Meg shook his head with a smile. This was giving Gyurge a headache. Father, look. Chapter 853. There was a little baby in the swaddling clothes. Her face was slightly flushed, and she was looking at Amy with a pair of big, bright black eyes. She reached out a little hand from the swaddling clothes and touched Amy's face with great effort, upon which an adorable smile appeared on her face. She's so adorable. A satisfied smile appeared on Amy's face. She then looked up at Mag, who was also looking at the baby with a smile on his face, and expectantly said, Father, shall we steal her away? Meg faltered slightly upon hearing this. He glanced at Gyurge, who was standing behind him with a wary expression. He had finally gotten a precious daughter after so long, so wouldn't he be digging a hole in her heart if he were to steal her away? He shook his head with a smile, and said, No, she's Uncle Gyurge's little baby, just like you're my little baby. If you steal her away, he'll be very sad. Amy shook her head with a serious expression, and said, That's all right. If Uncle Blue Fatty misses her, I can allow him to come and see her. She'll be super happy to be able to eat Father's delicious food every day if she lives in our house. Gyurge was about to step forward, but he was suddenly at a loss for words. If he lived in Amy's, he would be able to eat all kinds of delicious food for free every day. No, you can't. Meg shook his head with a smile as he looked at the baby, and said, She's so young, so she has to stay by her mother's side. She's happy to be able to eat delicious food, but she's even happier to be able to stay by her parents' side. Gyurge also stepped forward with a smile, and said, That's right. If little boss misses her in the future, you can come and play with her at any time. Amy looked down at the smiling little baby in the swaddling clothes, and nodded as she said, All right, then I'll let her stay by Uncle Blue Fatty's side. Thank you, Mr. Mac. Thank you for saving my 2 children and myself. Miranda made her way to the door and extended a deep bow toward Meg with gratitude in her eyes. There's no need to be so polite, mistress. I'm glad that you and your children are both healthy. Meg shook his head with a smile. It was a very heartwarming experience for him that 2 little lives had been safely brought into this world of his. Amy held the little girl named Chris and played with her for a while. When the little girl was hungry and crying for milk, Amy handed the little girl back to Gyurge. Of course. Of all. Seeing that the sky was already dark, Mag took Amy's little hand and bade farewell to Gyurge and his wife, preparing to leave. Wait. Hey, isn't this Palmer's favorite plate? Ever since you gave it to him, he hasn't been able to bear to use it, Miranda remarked with a hint of surprise in her voice. That's right, it's the most precious thing to him. Please take good care of your resident card, it contains your identity information. If you lose it, you can apply for a replacement at the City Lord's Castle. The City Lord's Castle will provide you with temporary accommodation and food until you find an official job. Phyllis looked at the number and her name on the palm-sized metal badge, and a complex expression appeared on her face. However, she still thanked the employee politely, and said, Thank you. You're welcome. Is there anything else I can help you with? The employee asked with a smile. During the past few days, she had received many elves who had come to Chaos City to seek asylum. Generally speaking, elves would be very excited after receiving a resident card, but this little elven girl's expression was a little unusual. However, it was said that this elf had been sent to Chaos City by Alex himself. According to her own statement, she was also Princess Irina's maidservant, so she naturally received a lot of attention. Chapter 854. The City Lord's Castle has arranged some jobs for you to choose from, but it's up to the job providers to decide whether you'll be hired or not. There will be a job fair at the City Lord's Castle tomorrow. Miss Phyllis, you can go and have a look. Perhaps you'll be able to find a suitable job, the worker said with a smile. Thank you. Phyllis nodded gratefully at the worker. Although she was a little disappointed to leave the Wind Forest, she felt respected in Chaos City. Regardless of whether it was the soldiers on the city wall or the workers at the City Lord's Castle, they all treated her kindly. This feeling made her feel a little uncomfortable, but also a little strange. She had heard the princess talk about Chaos City before, and she had never believed that there was such a place in this world where everyone was equal. She had never thought that she would really come here one day and become a resident. Phyllis followed the worker to the dormitory area. She looked up at the sky, which was full of twinkling stars. She couldn't help but think to herself, is the princess all right? She must not be used to being alone. Is he looking at me silently? But should I find a job to prove that I can take good care of the little mistress? One question after another appeared in her mind, and she was a little confused. When she was in the Wind Forest, she only needed to take good care of the princess, but now she had to think about so many problems and relationships. Shouldn't we tell her? Outside the ice cream shop, Elizabeth looked at Yarbemia, who was greeting customers with a smile on her face, and her brows furrowed slightly. Fox seems to be a little impatient. He summoned me back to the clan this time. If I don't come back, she'll probably never know the truth for the rest of her life. Elizabeth looked at Yarbemia's smiling face. That smile was so clean, without any pretense or reluctance. Only the joy and happiness that rose from the bottom of her heart could make such a touching smile appear on her face. But, will she really be happy if she knows all this? Elizabeth's heart was a little hesitant. She's here again. Sally looked at Elizabeth, who was standing in front of the French window, and followed her gaze to Yarbemia. Sally frowned. Why is she so concerned about MIA? Elizabeth seemed to have felt Sally's gaze as well. They looked at each other for a while before Elizabeth pushed the door open and walked in. The ice cream shop was warmer than they had imagined. Even though it was already late at night, there were still customers eating ice cream with smiles on their faces. Welcome. It's you. Yarbemia was pleasantly surprised to see Elizabeth. She had seen this beautiful girl many times at Amy's, and she had asked her some strange questions that had left a deep impression on her. Moreover, perhaps because the other party was a giant dragon, she felt that she could feel a strange feeling from this beautiful lady, which made her want to get closer to her. Yarbemia was curious, but she restrained herself from doing so. She was only a half-dragon, while the other party was a regal giant dragon that could soar through the sky. Elizabeth nodded and sat down in an empty seat by the window. She didn't know why she had come in here. What would you like to order? The ice cream is on the menu over there. Yarbemia walked up to her with a smile. I'd like a vanilla ice cream, Elizabeth replied in a calm voice. Why? Elizabeth replied calmly, but her reply was a little quick. Perhaps he just wanted to come in and have some ice cream to calm down. Sure, please wait a moment. Yarbemia nodded with a smile and quickly walked away. Soon, she returned with a vanilla ice cream. Thank you, Elizabeth said as she scooped up a spoonful of ice cream and put it into her mouth. This was a familiar taste. That special aroma was intoxicating, and the sweet taste of the ice cream made her forget all of her worries and worries. The ice cream shop closed at 10 o'clock, and after seeing off the last customer, Yarbemia turned off the lights before exiting the shop with Sally. It was late autumn, and there weren't many people on the streets of the Aden Square. However, there was a tall and slender figure standing not far away, looking at the two of them as they emerged from the shop. Yarbemia looked at Elizabeth with a perplexed expression as she asked, "Were you waiting for me? What do you want?" Sally stepped forward and stood in front of Yarbemia as she looked at Elizabeth with a wary expression. This wasn't the first time that this woman had been secretly observing Yarbemia. As a proud giant dragon with a 7th tier power, it was clearly not normal for her to keep an eye on a half-dragon waitress. "I have some things to say to her." "I don't mean any harm," Elizabeth said in a calm voice as she looked at Sally. Sally's eyes narrowed slightly, and she had no intention of stepping aside. Yarbemia made her way out from behind Sally with a smile, and said, "Don't worry, Aisha. She doesn't mean any harm. Why don't you go upstairs and sleep? I'll be back soon." Sally looked at Yarbemia before taking a meaningful glance at Elizabeth. She nodded and said, "All right, be careful." Then, she made her way toward an alleyway. Yarbemia looked at Elizabeth with a smile and asked, "Do you have something to say to me?" "We're about the same age, so you don't have to call me that," Elizabeth replied. A hint of elation flashed through Yarbemia's eyes, but she was still a little hesitant as she asked, "Really?" Elizabeth nodded in response. The smile on Yarbemia's face became even more vibrant. Elizabeth looked at the smile on Yarbemia's face, and her heart involuntarily relaxed. However, she couldn't bear to see her like this. If she knew the truth, would she still be able to smile like this? If she were to obtain the dragon origin, then she would be forced into this cruel battle for power. She had no choice. "Do you have something to say to me?" Yarbemia looked at Elizabeth with a curious expression. She had a feeling that Elizabeth had something to tell her. Elizabeth came to her senses, and asked in a calm voice, "What do you think your father is like?" "I've never seen him before." Yarbemia shook her head, but a smile quickly appeared on her face, and her eyes lit up as she said, "But I heard from Mother that he's a peerless hero in a suit of golden armor. He's an indomitable hero. He might be a hero, but he abandoned 2 sets of mother and daughter." Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to say this out loud as she looked at the expectant Mia. "Do you want to become a true giant dragon?" Elizabeth asked. Chapter 855. On the balcony of the restaurant. "Father, I'm thirsty. I want to go get some water. Wait for me here. I'll be back soon." Amy set down her long sword before running down the stairs. "Little girl." Mag wiped away the sweat on his forehead with a smile. Sword practice was now one of his daily activities. He practiced for an hour every night before going to bed, and it was very beneficial to his mastery of the sword technique. "But I've been practicing for almost an hour now, so I'm a little thirsty as well." Meg set down his long sword before also making his way downstairs. He was still a little concerned about letting Amy get some water by herself. Meg made his way to the staircase on the 1st floor, and was just about to leave when he suddenly stopped and cast his gaze toward the door. Amy was supposed to be drinking water, but she was holding on to the 2 ducks by their necks as she dragged them toward the door. Meg was quite amused to see her in such a pitiful state, and he was rather perplexed as he thought to himself, "What is Amy doing?" Meow tilde Ugly Duckling hurriedly followed along behind him, and its eyes were filled with concern. "Sure, shut up, Ugly Duckling." Amy turned to glare at Ugly Duckling before turning toward the staircase, and whispering, "It'll be bad if Father finds out." Meow. Ugly Duckling let loose a feeble cry before falling silent. "You still can't let me find out." Meg poked his head out again and looked at Amy with a curious expression. She was deliberately avoiding him, and where was she going with the 2 ducks? Amy set down the 2 ducks, and the 2 ducks panted heavily as they tried to squirm away from Amy in a horrified manner. "Don't run." Amy grabbed onto the ducks by their necks again before trying to reach for the doorknob. Her fingertips finally came into contact with the doorknob, and the door was unlocked with a crack. Phew. She heaved a faint sigh of relief before looking back at the 2 struggling ducks, and she hurriedly released them so that they could catch their breaths. She then picked them up by their necks again and tiptoed out of the room. Meg looked out to see Amy holding onto the 2 ducks, but she didn't go very far. Instead, she put down the 2 ducks at the door, and seemed to have said something to them before a ball of flames appeared in her hand. "Is she going to roast them?" Meg raised an eyebrow as he silently made his way over to the door before peering out. The two ducks were staring at Amy with horror in their eyes, and Ugly Duckling was also standing in front of the two ducks with a panicked expression. However, a hint of horror appeared in its eyes at the sight of the ball of flames in Amy's hand. Amy looked at the red-topped tricolor ducks, and slowly squatted down with an expectant look on her face as she said, "Such fat and ugly ducks must be delicious to roast. I'll roast them until they're golden brown, and I'll be able to eat one of their legs. I'll be super happy. Quack quack quack." The two ducks flapped their wings in a horrified manner, trying to get as far away from this demon as possible. However, their legs were bound together, so they were completely unable to move. They could only look on as the ball of flames slowly approached them, and they could feel the terrifying heat emanating from it. "Sigh, I was going to eat you too, but Ugly Duckling is so pitiful, so I decided to let you two go. I can't let Ugly Duckling experience the pain of losing its parents." Amy heaved a forlorn sigh as the ball of flames in her hand shrank down to the size of a chopstick. She slashed the ball of flames between the ducks' legs, and the ropes binding their legs were reduced to ashes. The two tricolor ducks immediately fell to the ground with blank expressions on their faces, as if they were completely oblivious to what had just happened, and they had even forgotten to run away. "If you don't leave now, I'm going to go back on my word. Father is going to make you two into roast ducks tomorrow." Amy's eyes were beginning to light up with anticipation again. Quack quack. The two red-topped tricolor ducks seemed to have come to their senses as they flapped their wings and flew toward the plaza. One of them was so panicked that it almost crashed into a tree, causing a pile of dried leaves to fall from the tree before disappearing into the distance as a pair of black dots. "Meow Tilda." Ugly Duckling looked on with excitement as the ducks flew into the distance. It then turned to Amy and rubbed its little head against her foot. "So you're just worried that Ugly Duckling will be sad?" Meg shook his head with a smile. This little guy was very kind. "All right, I know you're very happy." Amy patted Ugly Duckling's head with a smile as she looked at the blissful expression on its face, and said, "However, have you ever heard of the saying that a son must repay a father's debt?" Meow Tilda. Ugly Duckling turned to Amy with a perplexed expression. "Don't worry, you'll understand in the future." Amy picked up Ugly Duckling in her arms with a smile. She looked up at the sky again before entering the restaurant, and murmured to herself with a remorseful expression, "Watching those two roast ducks fly away really makes me sad. But how am I going to tell Father about this? It took him an entire day to catch them." Meg silently disappeared from the staircase. Amy had to have been worried that he wouldn't agree, so she had secretly released those two ducks. However, he was quite curious as to what reason Amy was going to use to tell him about this. "Father, please have some water." Meg waited on the balcony for a while, and Amy carefully made her way over to Meg with a glass of water in her hands. "Thank you, Amy." Meg accepted the glass of water with a smile and took a sip. At least she knew how to show some filial piety to him first. Amy looked up at Meg with an apologetic expression, and said, "I'm sorry, Father. I released those two ugly ducks because I thought Ugly Duckling would be sad." "That's all right. It's very encouraging to be able to empathize with your friend's feelings." Meg shook his head with a smile as he looked at Amy with approval in his eyes. Not only did she know how to empathize with her friend's feelings, but more importantly, she didn't try to lie. Instead, she was honest with him, and that was very important to him. A smile appeared on Amy's face as she nodded, and said, "Yes, but it's all right. Even though I released them, their children are still in my hands. They'll be returned to me sooner or later." A resigned smile appeared on Meg's face as he patted Amy's head, and said, "Then let's practice swordsmanship for a while more before going to bed." "Millimeter HM." Amy nodded as she picked up her long sword, and began to practice swordsmanship with Meg. Chapter 856. Amy, Sally, and the others were also looking at Meg with curiosity in their eyes. There was no new dish on the dining table that morning, so they were all curious about the new dish that Meg had promised to introduce today, the stinky tofu. "Is it stinky tofu pudding?" Amy asked. Is it made into stinky tofu after removing the brains from the tofu pudding? Barbara asked. Is it stinky? Sally was a little concerned. As an elf, she had a slight obsession with cleanliness. How do I put this? Meg looked at everyone's intense gazes. Stinky tofu was a very controversial delicacy. Those who loved it viewed it as a treasure, while those who didn't would stay away from it. Back in the day, Meg was one of those people who couldn't accept stinky tofu pudding. Even though there were some misunderstandings, if it weren't for the fact that he had been forced to endure the stench for so long in the test field for the god of cookery, he most likely still wouldn't be able to accept the stench. However, after creating that perfect stinky tofu, Meg's mindset had completely changed. There was a reason why stinky tofu was able to be found all over the food markets of the entire continent. Meg thought to himself for a moment before replying, "This is a snack with a strong flavor. It has a strong stench, but if you sniff it carefully, you'll discover a rich aroma. It will become an irresistible delicacy in your mouth. It might not be suitable for everyone, but those who do like it will definitely like it. However, it's not very suitable for breakfast, so I didn't make it for you. I want to eat it. I want to eat it." Amy raised her little hand. "I can only smell its aroma. I really want to eat stinky tofu." Meg looked at Amy, whose little face was filled with anticipation, and a doting expression appeared on his face. He then turned to everyone else, and said, "Who else wants to give it a try? However, I have to warn you that it does indeed have a strong flavor, so it's best not to try it unless you're sensitive to the stench." "I don't want to." Sally shook her head. Even though she believed that Meg's food would definitely be very delicious, she still couldn't accept it. "I don't want to either." Barbara also shook her head. She liked fragrant smells, but couldn't accept stinky ones. Can I try?" Yarbemia said weakly with a cautious expression. He felt that he might have made the wrong decision. "Okay, 2 sets. I'll make it for you after breakfast." Meg smiled and nodded his head. Things with a strong taste were best left for last. Moreover, he couldn't guarantee that the two of them would still have the appetite to eat breakfast after eating the stinky tofu. Breakfast was quickly finished, and Meg went into the kitchen to make stinky tofu. Amy and Yarbemia stood at the kitchen door and looked at Meg expectantly, while Sally and Barbara stood a little further away and looked in the direction of the kitchen with some resistance. System: activate the molecular isolation system. Isolate the area in the kitchen where the stinky tofu is made from the other areas. Isolate the area by table in the dining room. Meg said inwardly. After receiving the system's confirmation, he reached out and opened the jar of brine. A strong stench instantly gushed out. However, Meg was a real man who had drunk brine before. Moreover, he had been immersed in the test field for the god of cookery for dozens of days without sleep. He instantly found the fragrance within the jar and took a deep sniff with an intoxicated expression. He scooped out a dozen or so pieces of tofu that had been soaked in the jar early in the morning. The originally snow-white tofu had already turned black. He rinsed it with cold water and set it aside to drain. He poured tea oil into a wok and heated it until it turned red. Then, he placed all the tofu into the wok and deep-fried it over low heat for 5 minutes. When the surface of the tofu had turned brown, he scooped it out and placed it on a plate. He used a pair of chopsticks to poke a hole in the center of the stinky tofu. Then, he scooped up a small spoon of chili oil, soy sauce, and sesame oil. He added half a spoon of garlic paste and a small handful of coriander. Finally, he poured a spoonful of the secret sauce over it. A fragrant stinky tofu was ready. Why is there no smell at all? There's no fragrance or stench. Amy stood on her tiptoes at the entrance of the restaurant with a curious look on her face. That's right, it doesn't stink at all. Yarbemia also had a strange expression on her face. Mag had made it sound so serious just now, and she had been a little hesitant. But now, he was almost done, and she still didn't get anything out of him. It was very strange. I've set up a magic formation that can isolate odors in the restaurant and the kitchen. That way, the different types of food won't clash with each other, and the customers will be able to enjoy their meal without being disturbed by their surroundings. Meg placed the 2 servings of stinky tofu onto a tray before covering it with a metal lid. He made his way out of the restaurant with a smile, and said, "Find a place to sit." Amy and Yarbemia immediately sat down at the dining table near the entrance of the kitchen. They looked at the tray in Meg's hands with anticipation in their eyes. Sally and Barbara also made their way over to the table. According to Meg's instructions, the odor would be isolated from the dining table, so they didn't have to worry about the stench leaking out. Meg put down the tray with a smile, and said, "Even if your first impression is that it stinks, you have to endure it for a while. Perhaps you'll experience something different after that." He then lifted the lid of the tray. A pungent odor instantly wafted through the air, and Yarbemia almost reflexively sprang up from her chair. Her dragon tail suddenly appeared behind her, and she almost couldn't resist the urge to jump out of her chair. The sudden explosion of the stench had a massive impact on her. She had worked in dark and damp kitchens for many years, and had to deal with countless rotten ingredients that were obtained from unscrupulous bosses. She had also been forced to unclog pipes in the pitch-black sores. However, the stench that normal people couldn't tolerate was nothing compared to the stench that she was experiencing right now. If it weren't for Meg's instructions, she would have already rushed to the entrance of the restaurant to take in a breath of fresh air. "Is it that strong?" Sally and Barbara were both given a fright by the stench. At the same time, they were also quite relieved that Yarbemia's reaction had already exceeded that of when she was eating Ruggiamo. She had even uncontrollably transformed into her half-dragon form. Just how impactful was this stench? In contrast, Amy, who was sitting across from Yarbemia, was looking at the stinky tofu before her with an intoxicated expression. She didn't seem to be affected by the stench in the slightest. Instead, she had already picked up her chopsticks in high spirits. Everyone turned their attention to the 2 portions of inky black stinky tofu that were arranged neatly on long plates. The center of the plates was stuffed with condiments, and there were specks of coriander sprinkled over them. There was also a sticky brown sauce drizzled over the tofu, creating an extremely enticing sight to behold. Is such a smelly thing really edible? The same question flashed through both Sally and Barbara's minds at the same time. Amy carefully picked up a piece of stinky tofu with her chopsticks. She didn't even drop a single strand of coriander before taking a bite. As a princess who had to decorate her bedroom with fragrant flowers every day, the stench of stinky tofu had always been very far away from her. However, in this instant, she wanted to take the initiative to try it out. "Big Sister Barbara, even though it's super delicious, I can give you a piece of my stinky tofu," Amy said to Barbara with a smile as she picked up a piece of stinky tofu with her chopsticks. A drop of thick sauce dripped from the stinky tofu onto the plate, and the black stinky tofu seemed to have been plated with a layer of golden light. It was extremely enticing. Gulp. Barbara gulped again, and subconsciously took half a step forward. Just as she was about to step into the isolated space, she suddenly stopped. She crossed her arms in front of her chest, and resolutely said, "I'm definitely not someone who will eat smelly food. It's truly delicious, and its stench is only a camouflage." Amy shook her head and brought her chopsticks to Barbara's mouth with a smile as she said, "It really is super delicious." A rich aroma immediately wafted out, and it was so strong that she couldn't tell whether it was a stench or a fragrance, but she was certain that it was an aroma that made her want to escape. Chapter 858. It smells so good. Wave after wave of deliciousness washed over Barbara's soul. It was a delicacy that made even her soul tremble. All of her praises were condensed into a single word, which was the only word that could truly express what she felt in her heart. After swallowing the stinky tofu, a rich aroma lingered in her mouth. Barbara licked the sauce on her lips and took a deep breath. She felt an indescribable sense of pleasure. Everyone looked at Barbara with smiles in their eyes. In the face of deliciousness, all promises and declarations paled in comparison. These things were clearly unable to surpass the true desire in one's heart. Sally had retreated 2 tables away at some point, and there was also a smile on her face. Feeling everyone's gazes on her, a faint blush appeared on Barbara's face. She already wanted to find a hole in the ground and bury herself in it to resolve this moment of awkwardness. However, this stinky tofu was simply too delicious. That small piece of stinky tofu actually contained such rich and mellow deliciousness. The feeling of the scalding sauce jumping in her mouth and on the tip of her tongue was intoxicating. She couldn't help but look at the last piece of stinky tofu left on Amy and Yarbemia's plates. "No, this piece is mine." Amy smiled as she put the last piece of stinky tofu into her mouth and chewed happily. Barbara's gaze reluctantly moved away from Amy and looked at Meg. Meg glanced at his watch and shook his head with a smile. "If anyone else wants to eat, then you'll have to wait until after lunch. I have to send Amy to class." Sigh. Barbara sighed silently as she pressed down on the leftover sauce on the 2 plates. Then, the 2 of them picked up the plates in front of them, and finished the rest of the soup without leaving a single drop behind. They were still a little unsatisfied. Barbara was speechless. "Take a short break and get ready to welcome the customers," Meg said with a smile. He took a tissue and wiped Amy's mouth before pushing the bicycle out of the door. The system's molecular isolation system was indeed very powerful. The smells were limited to a certain area and did not affect each other. Moreover, the air could be purified after the guests finished their meal. When the next guest sat down, fresh air would be waiting for him. Yarbemia put away the plate and said in amazement, "This smell isolation system is amazing. It really can't emit any smell at all. Also, the air in here has become fresh again. The smell of the stinky tofu has completely disappeared." Barbara also walked in and sniffed carefully. The fresh air was like a forest in the morning. It was slightly moist, and she could no longer smell the stench of stinky tofu. "What kind of array is this? Why have I never heard of it before? Could it be that the magic on this continent has already been used to such an extent?" Barbara thought to herself with a frown, her heart filled with bewilderment. During this period of time, she had read many books about the history of the Norland continent, and had gained some understanding of this world that she had somehow arrived in. In the records of the Moon Nation, there were very few references to the Norland continent. She had only seen it once in an unsealed ancient book in her father's study. However, that ancient book had been sealed by magic, so she could only flip to the first page. There was a brief description of the Norland continent on the first page, and it was only a fragmented fragment. At the time, she had only been curious about whether there was a place called the Norland continent outside of the Moon Nation. Who would have thought that she would come to this place one day? What was the relationship between the Moon Nation and the Norland continent? What was written in that sealed book in her father's study? Why was there an ancient teleportation formation in the Moon Nation's royal palace that led to the Norland continent? One question after another piled up in her heart. She had flipped through countless ancient books in an attempt to find answers. Even though she didn't have a definitive answer, she was sure of one thing: the history of the Moon Nation and the Norland continent overlapped in ancient times. This was not a coincidence, it was a complete coincidence. The description was almost identical, and Barbara was sure that she hadn't misremembered. There had to be a special connection between the two, and what she wanted to do was to figure out this matter before she found a way to go back. However, the power level of the two worlds was about the same, and the use of magic in the Moon Nation was slightly stronger. The magic casters were able to use magic to create some highly effective things, not just for battle. However, what Barbara was sure of was completely baffled by this molecular isolation system. This highly effective and peculiar spell formation was not only able to isolate odors, but also purify the air in a small area. This ability was simply too miraculous. As a 7th-tier spatial magic caster, she was able to repair a dilapidated ancient teleportation formation on her own. Her talent in the field of magic spell formations was astonishing to the Imperial Preceptor. However, even she couldn't understand how such a spell formation could be set up. When Meg returned from sending Amy off, there was already a long line in front of the restaurant. All of the regulars greeted Meg with familiarity, and Meg also responded with a smile. He was able to remember the names and nicknames of all of the customers who had introduced themselves to him, so he was naturally more approachable. "Mr. Mac, I heard that there's going to be a new dish today, but what's that stinky tofu? Is it really stinky? Does it have anything to do with tofu pudding?" Harrison asked curiously. The restaurant's entrance also fell silent as everyone looked at Meg. This was also the question that they wanted to ask. Stinky tofu isn't stinky tofu pudding, but it does have a strong flavor. If you can't stand the stench or have misophobia, please be careful. At the same time, stinky tofu is a little special, so when you come in later, please decide whether you want to try stinky tofu today. The waiters will try to seat all of you at the same table as possible so that you don't give other customers a bad experience. Meg smiled as he spoke. His gaze paused slightly on Elizabeth, who was third in line. He didn't think that this frost dragon girl would come to line up so early in the morning. Is it really that serious? All of the customers were surprised. They were naturally looking forward to Amy's new dish, so they had all arrived early in the morning. If it weren't for the restaurant's limited capacity, the line would have most likely been twice as long. However, with Meg's nimble style of doing things, he had actually given so many reminders. He had even gone so far as to seat all of the customers who had ordered stinky tofu. This made everyone feel a little uneasy about the stench of the stinky tofu, and even their determination to try the new dish had become a little uncertain. It stinks. Then will the restaurant also become stinky? Elizabeth's frosty brows furrowed slightly. Chapter 859. The customers entered the restaurant with mixed feelings, but this time, they didn't rush to sit down. Instead, they were hesitant about where they should sit. Customers who want to order stinky tofu this morning, please sit at the leftmost table. Everyone else is free to sit. The stinky tofu is only available at night, and only 100 servings a day until they are sold out. Today's trial sale is an exception, Meg said with a smile. All of the customers who had made up their minds that they wouldn't eat the stinky tofu quickly returned to their seats. However, some of the customers who were still very interested in the new dish were beginning to hesitate. Mag's words were a little harsh, but Boss Mag's products had never disappointed him. If the stinky tofu really was disgusting, there was no way he would serve it to his customers. "It's Miss Elizabeth." Yarbemia looked at Elizabeth with surprise and joy. Seeing that she was about to sit down on the right, she couldn't help but whisper, "The stinky tofu is really delicious. I highly recommend it. Is it good?" Elizabeth looked at Yarbemia with surprise. Her eyes were full of sincerity, and she hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the leftmost table. "Someone actually wants to try it." Elizabeth's seat immediately attracted everyone's attention. She was the first customer who chose to sit on the leftmost table, and she was a frosty beauty. Mag also turned to Elizabeth with a hint of surprise on his face. Could this young lady really tolerate such a foul odor? Also, Yarbemia seemed to have said something to her that made her change her mind. Were they already so familiar with each other? Some of the customers who were originally wavering also took their seats one after another when they saw that someone had already taken the lead. They sat at the leftmost tables. Harrison also sat opposite Elizabeth with a reserved smile. Although he was just an ordinary person, as a businessman, he still had a good eye. Although the young lady in front of him was beautiful, she wasn't someone he could mess with. She was the kind of person who could kill him with a flick of her finger. If it weren't for the fact that he was already useless, he wouldn't want to sit here. 1111 sat next to Elizabeth, while Lulu sat opposite 1111. "Hello." 1111 greeted Elizabeth and Harrison with a smile as soon as she sat down. Then, she let out a sigh of relief and said, "Thank goodness I got the last seat. This is Mr. Mac's new product. I can't believe there are people who are still hesitating." "Hello," Harrison replied with a smile. As a regular customer of the restaurant, he was rather familiar with this couple who liked to show off their affection every day. After they sat down, he immediately felt much more relaxed. "Hello." Elizabeth nodded slightly. Her gaze lingered on 1111 for a while. These two didn't look like humans, but they didn't look like elves either. She couldn't see through them. As a proud dragon, Elizabeth had never shared a table with a human before. However, ever since she came to Mammoth, not only humans, elves, and even demons had shared a table with her. There seemed to be a strange atmosphere in this restaurant. When all the customers were immersed in their own food, they would forget about their own race and prejudice. All they could see was the food in front of them, so they could ignore who was sharing a table with them. One sweet tofu pudding, one Yangju fried rice, and Elizabeth looked up at Yarbemia and said, one stinky tofu. The customers began to place their orders. Meg turned around and went into the kitchen. He really started to get busy. Boss, should we try Mr. Mac's new product? Keel asked Sargeras. They were already waiting in line at the door. He looked at Sargeras eagerly. Isn't it stinky? I hate stinky things the most. I don't want it. Mond shook his head. Let's look at the price first. The third batch of warriors is already on their way. We have to prepare enough holy Rugiamos for them. This unimportant new product may consume our limited supply of holy Rugiamos. Sargeras shook his head with a cautious expression. This stinky tofu is 300 copper coins per serving. It's the same price as the Rugiamos, a customer said as he opened the menu. We'll buy the holy Rugiamos, Sargeras said with a serious expression. I agree. Keel raised his hand with a serious expression. The members of the Burning Legion all nodded in agreement. The customers who had decided to try the stinky tofu in the back weren't in a hurry. 300 copper coins was a small matter. If the stinky tofu was really that stinky, it could affect their mood for the whole day. If that happened, they wouldn't be able to enjoy the rest of the food. Elizabeth's Yangju fried rice and tofu pudding arrived one after another. However, the stinky tofu wasn't served right away. Only after she finished her tofu pudding did Yarbemia walk over to her gracefully with a platter covered with a metal lid. The customers all looked at the platter, craning their necks to see what the stinky tofu looked like. They wanted to know if it was really as disgusting as Meg had said. However, the metal lid was so tight that they couldn't see what was inside at all. Here's your stinky tofu. Yarbemia placed the platter in front of Elizabeth with a smile. Then, she reached out and grasped the handle of the lid. Harrison subconsciously leaned back a little, and became uneasy again. He had just eaten all the other delicacies, and his happiness was already at its peak. If he were to be disgusted by this last dish, then it would be a huge loss. 1111 inched forward with an expectant look on her face. Her eyes lit up as she looked at the platter. As a foodie who had eaten all over the continent to escape from her pursuers, she didn't care about the smell as long as it was delicious food. There really are people in this world who want to eat stinky food? That's really strange. Yeah. Even though I have a lot of confidence in Mr. Mac, I just can't bring myself to like stinky food. I'm more worried about whether the stinky smell will spread and affect our meal after the lid is removed. The customers discussed among themselves in hushed voices. Some of the customers who were enjoying the food had worried expressions on their faces. Elizabeth's expression was calm, and she didn't seem to be worried at all. However, the light in her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. She took a glance at Yarbemia, and thought to herself, if she says it's delicious, then it can't be wrong. The smell shouldn't be too bad, either. Let's sit down for now. Yarbemia held the lid in her hand, and removed it with a smile on her face. Steam surged, and a rich aroma wafted through the air. Whoa! Harrison almost sprang up from his chair. He jumped 2 meters, and almost crashed into the table behind him. The honest smile on Lulu's face disappeared. His body leaned back subconsciously, and the chair creaked as if it was going to fall apart at any moment. Even 1111, who had been looking forward to the dish this entire time, covered her nose with her hand. What? Chapter 860. After the lid was removed, the reactions of the few people sitting at the table were a little unexpected. What kind of terrifying stench could make a fatso jump 2 meters out of his chair and force a giant dragon to raise an ice wall in an attempt to keep the air at bay? Even the customers sitting at that table reflexively took a step back, trying to get as far away from that table as possible so that they wouldn't be affected by the stench. Every time Amy's released a new dish, everyone would drool at the sight of it, but this time, everyone wanted to run away from it. Is it really that bad? Meg looked around at the chaotic restaurant. He had already asked Amy and Yabemia to try this dish, but it appeared that this stench was still quite potent. He was beginning to regret not opening the curtains and inviting Amy to eat at the table in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. There was no need for any words of recommendation, and all of the customers were already swarming toward the stinky tofu like moths. I bet that no one will be able to eat this so-called stinky tofu. This stench is simply too pungent. It's like... Harrison looked at the stinky tofu on the table with a hint of fear lingering in his eyes, and he was momentarily at a loss for words. However, he still put on a confident expression as he said, "In any case, no one will be able to eat this stinky tofu. Otherwise, I'll run around the Aden Square naked." Everyone was even more convinced of their own judgment. This was the account of someone who had personally experienced it, so it was extremely credible. All of the customers who had already decided not to eat the stinky tofu smiled at their wise decision. Meanwhile, many of the customers who had chosen to sit on the far left had already decided to remove the stinky tofu from their order list, or were preparing to cancel the stinky tofu that they had already ordered. But why can't we smell that stench? Also, it seems that aside from the smell of the food at the same table, we can't smell anything outside of this table, a customer asked in a surprised manner. All of the customers also began to look around upon hearing this. Many of them had already sensed that there was something different about the restaurant today, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. Now that the stinky tofu had been released, all of the other tables in the restaurant were completely unaffected by the stench, and this clearly reflected the difference between the two tables. The smell seemed to be separated by an invisible wall. Even a powerful magician would not be able to sense the existence of this wall. The wonderful isolation was amazing. Of course, this also made the customers feel relieved. If the smell was isolated, they wouldn't have to worry about their appetite being affected. Mr. Mack was indeed a considerate boss. He was very considerate of his customers. What should I do if I can't eat after ordering? Did Mr. Mack's new product fail? A customer asked softly. Everyone's attention was drawn back to the stinky tofu in front of Elizabeth. The stinky tofu was ink black in color with a small pinch of fresh green coriander. It was neatly stacked on top of the blue and white porcelain plate, with a thick but not too thick brownish-black sauce drizzled over it. It looked very enticing. If it wasn't for the stench that made people unable to sit still, this was a delicacy that made people salivate. However, after smelling the stinky tofu for himself, Harrison guaranteed that no one would be able to withstand the stench. As a result, this dish was excluded from the menu by most of the customers. Mr. Mack was a genius. He had created one amazing dish after another. His unique cooking method and the wonderful combination of ingredients brought about a wonderful and innovative taste. However, it was inevitable for a genius to make mistakes. Most of the customers had an understanding attitude. "I'm already looking forward to the next new product," a customer said with a smile. He scooped a spoonful of fried rice into his mouth, and the smile on his face grew wider. The customers' gazes fell on Elizabeth. They wanted to know how she was going to deal with this situation. Ever since Mammis opened, there hadn't been a customer who was dissatisfied with the taste of the food. However, Elizabeth, who was separated by a layer of ice in front of her, didn't look like someone who would finish the stinky tofu in front of her. "This is really fragrant. It's super delicious." Yabemia thought to herself anxiously. The stinky tofu was supposed to be so delicious, but it had been completely misunderstood. Just like before, she couldn't help but fall in love with the taste after tasting it. However, if all of the customers gave up on the dish because of the smell, then wouldn't the boss's painstaking efforts go to waste? Elizabeth's beautiful brows furrowed. In that instant, she almost couldn't resist the urge to transform back into her dragon form. The stench was so strong that she had never smelled such a strange stench in her entire life. She was completely caught off guard. Frost dragons loved cleanliness the most among the dragon race. Frost Island was covered in ice all year round, so there was not a single bit of debris to be seen. There was also no strange smell. Food was even more particular. Cleanliness was the lowest standard. Any strange smell would be eliminated. However, the stinky tofu in front of her had already exceeded the range of a strange smell. If it weren't for the fact that Yarbemia was standing right beside her, she definitely would have already left. This stinky tofu. Elizabeth's voice sank slightly. This isn't actually a stinky smell. Instead, it's a rich aroma. Because the aroma is so strong, it's actually a stinky smell. However, if you sense it carefully, you'll find that there are no impurities in the aroma. It's pure and alluring. Yarbemia was a little anxious as she looked at Elizabeth with a hint of anticipation in her eyes. There were many familiar customers here, but at this moment, the one that Yarbemia wanted to ask the most was Elizabeth. Every time she came to the restaurant by herself, she would ask her some strange questions from time to time. Elizabeth was already prepared to refuse, but she hesitated momentarily at the sight of Yarbemia's sincere pleading eyes. She then began to examine the stinky tofu in front of her again. The aroma behind the ice wall was a lot fainter, and it wasn't as strong as it had been when the lid had been removed. Putting aside her first impression of the stinky smell, she could sense that there was indeed a hint of a fragrant aroma in the air. As she focused her attention on the stinky tofu, the aroma gradually became more pronounced. It was no longer pungent, but rather alluring, and Elizabeth's brows gradually relaxed. Ding! The ice wall shattered into nothingness before it fell to the ground, and the aroma that had been blocked by the ice wall once again rushed toward her. However, on this occasion, Elizabeth didn't raise the ice wall again. Instead, she closed her eyes to sense the aroma that was surging toward her. It really wasn't a stinky smell. Instead, it was an extremely rich aroma. The restaurant had already fallen silent, and all of the customers were looking at Elizabeth with surprise on their faces. They clearly didn't think that she would remove the ice wall and directly face the unbearable stench. What is she trying to do? Harrison murmured in confusion. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.